Yeah. Okay. Buenos días. Es un placer estar aquí. I would like to, before I get started with this third one, yesterday, I didn't completely finish something. I will not ask to even go over it. You can look it up if you want, if you get access to these slides. But at the very end, we were talking about the kind of what we could call more heterodox or post-Keynesian, whatever, mandates for central banks that one could, potentially could implement. In fact, in some regards, they did it implicitly, as I was trying to show in after the global financial crisis, and I'll explain in a minute. But I want to just finalize this, just to complete, because I think I left people hanging a bit there on this one. Or I don't know, maybe you didn't realize it, but I clearly just skipped stuff at the end there. But the point is that if you think of what the mainstream view is, right, the generally accepted is inflation targeting now. There are God knows how many countries in the world that subscribe to inflation targeting officially. And it's usually around that 2%. Where did that come from? God knows, because it's just one of the, it's like, I asked the question, why is there a 3% rule and a 60% rule for the Eurozone with regards to deficits or debt ratios? And nobody really knows, okay, exactly. It just sounded as a good round number, okay, almost, but it's not based on any serious analysis. And the 2%, I think it comes from perhaps from Taylor himself, John Taylor, and when he wrote that first article in the early 1990s on that, because he was looking at data on real interest rates over a long historical period before, and concluded that that was the natural rate kind of thing. So that, I mean, it's just, as I said, it's a fantasy world in many ways. Okay? But it is, unfortunately, it has real effects. That's the bad side. Okay? Otherwise, if they could fantasize it all they want. Okay? But the point here is that is the generally established, kind of framework. And I emphasize the fact, remember when I distinguished between the Yellen rule versus the Taylor rule. The Taylor rule is single objective of that 2% inflation. The Yellen rule instead, you could read that into it. And they did, she did, okay? A dual mandate, meaning full employment and price stability, let's say. If you take the actual mandate, from 1978 law of Congress on that in the US. So we have the generally established one, but there are others that have been proposed, obviously, primarily, almost exclusively, actually not 100%, but almost, okay, from heterodox economists. Because you could find some mainstream economists. In a way, Janet Yellen is very mainstream in her thinking and in analytics, but she believes in a dual mandate view of central banking. Dual meaning that, we got to worry about also unemployment. You can't just be fixated on that 2%. Okay? And however, there are others out there, and I'd just like to mention them, because we already come to that in a sense. As I said, I don't have the actual lecture one from yesterday here on the screen, but just to remind you that we did already come to some of that with the Pasinetti index. Now, the Pasinetti index is simply a calculation, okay, as to the what kind of interest rates, okay, that are deemed more neutral or less, in a sense, okay? And that will come to the way in which we'll frame it now, but it's not just the Pasinetti. Before I get to the Pasinetti one, There's another one, which is what is at the beginning, was the early 2000s. They came out, it's called the Kansas City Rule because they debated it in Kansas City, the MMT, okay? The Kansas City Rule. How many of you have ever heard of it? Okay. What it is, okay, is that they set the nominal central bank rate, let's say the overnight rate or the federal funds rate, at 0. Now, why? Because they say, well, that's really the natural rate. They play on the word natural because, as you know, there's a natural rate of interest, like the Vixelian, the mainstream view about this neutral rate or whatever. And they say, well, the natural rate of interest really is 0 because all the central bank does is what? It's nothing. There's no resource cost. It's not determined by productivity or whatever out there, okay? Therefore, it should be 0. Now, there are all kinds of consequences of that, but the idea simply is, okay, 0 rate of interest among banks when they, they transfer reserves among themselves, okay? It would be 0, which, I mean, it's fine. I mean, you could say, who cares? I mean, it could be that, it could be, or the way it is now, like in Canada, I think it's 2.25, the target rate. So it is that which they pay among themselves. If they borrow from the surplus bank, the reserves, that's deficit bank will pay 2.25% per annum. It's overnight though, on an overnight rate. I wouldn't know what to calculate it in terms of 365 days or what it would be, but divided by 365. Okay, and that would be at least for the mainstream now, that's the rate that is the neutral one for today. If you read the Bank of Canada, for instance, or wherever, okay, they defend the view that that's the neutral rate in the current context. And they have all these kind of calculations there, which are completely, as I said, I've read all this stuff, and I could tell you there are a lot of problems. Okay? But obviously, it's a fictitious thing to me, the notion of a neutral rate. While for the Kansas City proposal, they just simply played on that notion of the natural or neutral, whatever, and said, no, it should be 0. And then all the other rates, the bank lending, whatever, the prime rate, all these sorts of rates out there, they're markups on that 0 overnight rate. Instead of being marked up on 2.25, let's say, it's on 0. Okay, so that's one proposal. And the reason why it is such a debated one is because some have written on that. I will not go through it. I mean, we don't have time. I got to get to this topic now. But some people have questioned it because they've argued that it could lead to certain problems of instability in the setting of it. Okay, I will not go through it. But if you read Smithson, one of those people, okay, they have questioned it. Okay, they've said that there are others that are better. And indeed, guess what? John Smithson has his rule, let's call it, the John Smithson rule. But John Smithson, I've known him for like, God knows, not for 40, 50 years. He changed his opinion at some point, It used to be that it ought to be around, it to be a very low rate, real interest rate rule, not a nominal interest rate rule, okay? A real one now, adjusted by inflation. But initially, it was supposed to be a very low rate, and it was never clear. He wrote about that, and he wrote that from this book that he wrote years ago on the revenge of the rentiers. Okay, on looking at the data. Remember, we saw the data series last class, and what he argues now is that it ought to be 0, but it should be a 0 real interest rate rule. So again, if it's the overnight rate, okay. It would be now, for Canada, it would be, if the inflation rate is 2%, let's say in our case, or almost, okay, I think it's about 2.2 or something, okay? But, let's say if it were 2%, if we're hitting the target, then it would mean that the nominal interest rate ought to be 2%, okay? for the overnight rate. And now there's another rule that I wanted to talk about, which is the one that, I mean, I'm not, how should I say, I embrace it wholeheartedly, completely, okay? Because there's a bit of arbitrariness in all that. I'll get to that in a minute. But over the years, both myself and my colleague, Mark Lavoie, have written a whole lot of stuff on that, okay? And it comes from the fact that Luigi Pasinetti had come to Ottawa and spent a semester, teaching courses. And he gave me this book. Well, he gave me a bunch of books. He was very nice with me. He gave me a bunch of books that he brought with him. And one of them was his book of 1981 on the wealth of nations. I mean, it's a very important book, actually. I think it's very interesting for the neo-Ricardian kind of reasoning and analysis. It is by far one of the best books to it. And there's a chapter, I can't remember if it's chapter 8 or whatever it is there now, which talks about the interest rates. Okay. And he doesn't really come out with it very well, but in it, he describes what should be what he calls a kind of natural rate of interest idea. It's not the Vixel natural rate, but he played on those terms. Okay. And for him, the natural rate of interest ought to be one where on a purely normative level. Now, I have to, normative here, meaning that it's based on issues of justice. More specifically, in terms of Aristotelian, okay, Aristotle, okay? So in the Catholic Church, very famous in the Middle Ages, Aristotelian logic here, of just what we call commutative justice. Now, Aristotle wrote on justice in his ethics and all that. And he had different types of justices that applied. And, in a sense, what I think inspired Pasinetti was this kind of reasoning, because it is normative, for him, indeed for all the post-Keynesians, I would argue, these interest rates, remember we said it's an incomes policy. So it's a normative question, what you should be earning. It's not based on productivity or whatever, marginal productivity theories. Okay, so you could see here Pasinetti struggling with an analytical model, which is like the Sraffa model and all this sort of stuff, but he introduces this sort of natural rate of interest that is a purely normative one. And the one he proposes was the one where you are able to maintain constant over time, okay, the value of those, let's say, savings or whatever you have as an asset, okay, of a financial asset, it remains constant in labor values. Now, we could get into the whole issue why, but it's in labor unit terms. So think of it, it's like if you look at the average wage or something in an economy, you will then have to look at what is the labor that it commands over time. Okay, so for instance, if it's 100 pesos or something, well, what's the wage rate? Let's assume it's 10. It's not. That doesn't sound, even for Mexico, I'm sure that's too low. But I'm just giving a way to calculate. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm just saying here. Okay, or in Canada, in Canada, what in Ontario we have about, it's $18 an hour. Let's say almost $20 an hour. Okay, our minimum wage. But so if you have $100. What would be the labor units that it commands? It commands 5, right? 100 divided by 20 will give you 5 units, okay, value. Or if you do it yearly, I mean, you could do whatever you want. You could calculate it. The time frame is not important here right now. And the point of this is simply to say that he wanted to have it so that it remains constant over time in terms of labor command. But we initially started to writing about this. We actually argued that in those days, remember, this is in the 80s, the early 80s, when we first were looking at this. And at the time, if you believed in the stylized facts coming from Kaldor, I don't know if anybody have ever come across Kaldor, literally going back to the 60s and 70s, where he wrote about the stylized facts on growth. and where he argued that, it seems that over time, the share of labor is constant, more or less, meaning that real wages grow with productivity. And indeed, until around 1980, if you look at data from many countries, not just the United States, but especially the United States, but even Canada, you have the same similar phenomenon, where if you look at real wages, for the since 1980, literally, it's been pretty much flat, not complete. There's some fluctuations, but it's only in recent times that actually went up during the pandemic and then went down again. So, but otherwise, except for the crisis, let's call it a period, okay, it's been flat, or even maybe declining a bit. But let's say it's flat. What that means, of course, is that wages are growing with prices, more or less, proportionally over long periods. But what Kaldor was finding during that early post-war period was that they were actually growing with productivity. But when you get to around 1980, you start seeing the real wage going like this, flat, let's say, productivity continuing to rise. Okay? So obviously that creates a problem. Remember what we talked about yesterday with that Pasinetti index, that calculation, okay? You could see that even when you adjust for the fact that there's a gap, a growing gap between real wages and productivity, okay, it does not really change things. And if they didn't change, so remember, we're thinking about it in the early 80s, okay? We argued that maybe a much easier one, which is compatible with the way incomes policies are framed historically with regards to wages. Remember, when we talked about the incomes policies, whether it's down, up, or up, down policies, they were tying real wages with productivity growth. Why? In order to maintain distributionally neutral between wages and profit in the economy. Okay? Because the share of wages, if you do a calculation here, will be constant when real wages grow with productivity. Well, we said, why don't we actually do that also for the real interest rates? Okay? So initially, because we want to frame this as an incomes policy again, and a rule about normative, again, rule as to how to make it distributionally neutral. Okay? But in this case, it's between rentier and non-rentier income. Okay? So you could see here is that we were struggling with all this, and it gets complicated. But to be short, because I have to finish this now, and 5 more minutes and that's it. But they clearly, the two move in tandem, whether you look at it in terms of the Pasinetti rule that ties, in this case, real interest rates to real, in this case, about productivity growth, okay, is compatible with the other one, which is the labor command. Remember the labor unit one, okay? It is compatible with that, where you tie real wage growth to the real interest rate or the overnight rate, whatever, we were using as a kind of, what do you call it, a reference point here, okay? And what is important, therefore, is that they're not the same, in fact. And the difference is because of what happened when they bifurcated. Remember, the real wage and productivity started to bifurcate. They used to move in tandem during like most of the post-war period. So that meant that the share of labor was constant, more or less, during that period. But then it changed, and share of labor collapsed, as we know. But that the differences between our early what we call the traditional Pasinetti index, based on productivity and real interest rates growth comparison, or the other one, which is between real wages and real interest rate gap, okay, they're not a bit. It has changed, okay, because of that. But it's actually, when I showed the data yesterday, you would have seen that although they go more or less in tandem still. So which actually suggests that what's the real problem in terms of interest rates, the share of rentier versus non-rentier is what happens to interest rates. Because although there's changes going on between profits and wages, which is true, what's even more important when we look at the shares of rentier, that it is that measure, that Pazinetti index there, that suggests that you get us, that you could see the evolution. Now, there's what we call the Pazinetti rule, and it's based on this Pazinetti index idea, okay? And our Pazinetti rule, now there are two because we have two different types of indexes. The original one that you find in Pazinetti is the labor command one, which is simply where you have wages or real wages moving in tandem with the real interest rates. So if the real wage is equal, the real wage growth is equal to, in this case, the real interest rate, okay, whatever it is, that will give you a neutral interest rate effect so that it keeps, in this case, the share or the relation between rentier and non-rentier incomes constant in a sense over time. It is neutral in that sense. But even when you do the other one, which to me is much easier, though it's actually simpler, the original one, but the other one is it's interesting only because you do that for all the shares, even for the wage share, you apply the productivity one, growth as the comparison. And even if you use that one, which is where real, in this case, interest rate is equated to productivity growth, okay? You could figure out, like, for instance, if you think of long-term productivity growth, it used to, I've looked at data on that over the years. We used to have very high productivity growth, but since the late 70s and 80s, it has flattened out somewhat. Now, we wonder why. Okay, we could discuss why. But the point is that it is lower. So if it used to be, let's say, for our country was, let's say, 3.5%, 4% even in the early post-war years, real average productivity, it's gone down to maybe 1.5% now, on average, a dramatic fall. And I could tell you why. It has to do with the policies, the way I would argue. Yeah, but even with that one, it would mean, so for instance, if we're looking at it today, if the inflation rate, let's say, is 2%, okay, and the productivity growth is 1.5%, what should be, in this case, the overnight rate? Okay, you could do the calculation here. I'll let you do it. It's pretty obvious. Okay, but the point is that it's the gap between productivity growth and the real interest rate that needs to be done when you have a 2% inflation rate. Okay, and we argued that it's a good, I think it's a reasonable way to try to institute within the central bank's mandates. Okay, if you put in, remember, I wrote a petition that we circulated. We tried to change the mandate of the Bank of Canada at the time. This is, as I said, going back some years. And what we were asking was that they shouldn't be worrying about the inflation rate because they really can't control it very well. Okay? But they certainly should be worried about unemployment or employment growth or output growth. But just like the dual mandate of the Fed, is the US Fed, they have a dual mandate, which is inflation and achieving full employment. So they should have that, we argued, at least a dual mandate. And also they said they should be monitoring how their interest rate policies impact, how monetary policy impacts on income distribution. They should be monitoring it. And not just the personal distribution of income in terms of inequalities, which they're not talking about, as I said, especially since the global financial crisis, but the functional distribution of income in terms of rentier income and non-rentier income. Okay? So that's what we were pushing for. And the Pazinetti rule provides one way of neutralizing that effect, so to speak. Okay? So they should be considering that. But they're not considering any of these things. I mean, we're dreaming if we see that right now. But the point is that this is what we were, pushing for in terms of mandates, literally. Okay, and obviously it's not going to happen anytime soon. But I do believe that they have changed it a bit, by the way. Actually, our lobbying changed it, the policy. Not officially, but everything they've been doing shows that they are considering the unemployment one, at least. Okay? So in that sense, I think we had a little bit of effect, okay, in shocking them, whatever. We harassed them enough there they start talking about it, at least. Okay. But we'll see what happens now, because it's every 5 years they do a kind of a renewal of the mandate. The government does that. Okay. And we'll see this time around with Carney there. Who knows? Okay. But so this is where I want to mention that. Now, I should just say one thing and then we'll stop, which is, and I'll start with the next topic, which is that this is all very nice for certain countries that are not concerned about other things. Now, I'll give you a simple example. In our case, we have a pure float, because we'll show you. Okay? We have a pure float in terms of the exchange rate. Excuse me, I'm going to lose my voice. And what we have is that in some countries, like in Latin America especially, not only the ones that are dollarized, but also this whole problem, because of the original sin and all these issues, right? There's a real concern in trying to maintain stable or fixed exchange rates. I mean, it's a preoccupation. Even here in Mexico, I'm sure, okay? But we're not. We're completely the opposite. I mean, really, totally. And I could explain in part why, okay? But we'll discuss it later in the next lecture here I'm supposed to do now. So I'm just saying, you could see why if you introduce other variables that they should be concerned about, it gets even more complicated. So I wouldn't say to Argentina or God knows, to certain countries, or Mexico, that you should follow the Pazinetti rule in a simple way, because it's ridiculous. You have to worry about other things as well. In fact, in the paper that I did with Luis Philippe, that is available in Spanish, right? That for the bank, the Central Bank of Argentina at the time, we did say exactly that. We said that, obviously, we were looking at that for certain countries that do not face certain problems like that. We don't have an original sin kind of problem in Canada, like you have in certain countries. Okay, we're not that dollarized or whatever, so that is not an issue. But for certain countries, it is. So obviously, there you got to worry about other things that could also crash the economy, even more so. Yeah. But having said that, it is something that should be in the consideration. It should be on the radar. That's all we said, of the central bank, not the inflation rate, which, as I said, they cannot control, but they could control that rentier, non-rentier income by every time they adjust the interest rates. So they should have that on their radar. What the heck are they doing? Anyways, that's it. Okay. Let me now go on, unless there's a question. I mean, if there is, I'll do it, because we're going to go into a rather different topic now. Okay. Well, everything is related, we're going to see. Okay. But this is obviously a very different topic. Okay. Now, well, anyways, we're going to talk initially. Well, I actually, just from the title, I wanted to do something which I would argue was a rather more adventurous. Okay. And indeed, I really stuck my nose into something that some people would find rather, especially some of our MMT people that I subscribe to a great deal, as I said, absolutely. Okay. But will find more heretical even. Okay. So I would, we'll see what it's about. But it's a catch-all of a lot of other things right now that are happening. And I've been trying to work on the paper. I thought I'd have it done for here, but I didn't have enough time for all kinds of problems I had there. But I'm just saying that it will be written up. So let me just start here with this whole issue of globalization versus de-globalization. It's like financialization. These are all these buzzwords, as they say, that are used to describe things. that mean so many things sometimes that we haven't a clue sometimes what they actually mean, but they just become, what's the term, anchored somewhere, and we use it, and refer to it without ever, like neoliberalism. What the heck is that? Or etc. It's a lot of things, and sometimes they don't add up. Okay, but nonetheless, I would argue, actually, as I was trying to show there, globalization is certainly not a new phenomenon, okay, under capitalism. I mean, to think that all of a sudden, I don't know, in the last 50 years or something, we became globalized. I mean, it's nonsense. Okay? If it is in terms of trade or investment flows. Okay? In fact, you had, if you look at the 19th century as an example, cross-border trade in goods and services and technology, flows of investment, people, lots. You think now we got a lot of migration going on. Look at the 19th and 18th centuries, especially crossing the Atlantic, huge flows, okay? And I'm one of them, by the way. Some may say that this strong kind of globalization really started, okay, when Britain unilaterally became free trading country, okay, adopted free trade in the middle of the 19th century, in the late 1840s. Okay? And they did this, of course, by dismantling all of this kind of mercantilist protectionism that had existed for centuries, going back to the 16th and 17th centuries, literally. Now, Polanyi described what he called the subsequent process of a double movement. Okay? And there were all sorts of social and government responses to these changes in this globalized beginnings of the trade globalization form that we refer to it today. And of course, these were in the form of tariffs. Germany, all of these countries, even like we were a colony of Britain, well, officially until 1867, but we right away in the 1870s in Canada, we established a tariff wall, big jump. So on certain products, like, I don't know, clothing or something, or certain light industries, it was maybe around 30% or more, even, okay, tariffs, to protect ourselves from not just the Americans, who were doing the same, by the way, especially after the Civil War, but protect ourselves against Britain, our colonial, that we still have, as you know, we still have a constitutional monarchy. We're still part of the Commonwealth. Okay, so they set up these tariffs. Now we did that, and I mean, people complain, obviously. I mean, the British complain, but we went ahead, even though we were quite vulnerable. Okay, so I'm just saying, all of that, if in a sense, was to promote industrialization. That was usually the argument. Okay, if you look at Germany, for instance, but also there are other reasons that I could tell you, on the side, they're almost in parentheses. Okay, and obviously the other reasons were, one was that government revenues, like the great majority, over 3/4, let's say, in the late 19th century, of federal government revenues in our case, came from the tariff. We didn't have goods and services taxes, consumption taxes. We didn't have income taxes. That came out during the First World War in our case. Okay? We didn't have many of what now exists as tools to be able to engage in taxation, for instance. Okay? So the tariff was one of those. And it was not only to protect itself against inundation of products from Britain that was the premier power in terms of industrialized countries, okay? But essentially to be able to assert our presence, vis-a-vis especially the Americans at the time. Okay, but it was it was being done then. So again, I mean, what we're debating today about the tariffs right now with Trump and all these other things, well, they were debating them over a century ago. Okay, so we're still there in so many ways, but it's a very different world. Okay, but it was also globalized then. That's what I'm trying to say. To say that somehow we've globalized over the last whatever is, as I say, it's absolutely not correct. Okay, but you know, in the case of these, unlike what they call the industry, the infant industry kind of tariffs. You know, remember, I'm sure all of you go back to Frederick List in the 19th century, a German writer who defended the idea of infant industries that we have to protect before they grow up, kind of thing. Okay, and unlike that, okay, we had an international trading system that built up tariffs throughout the late 19th century. Okay, then it got rid of them slowly, you know. And then guess what? You know, by the time we get, both during the First World War, but more importantly after, with the United States unilaterally during the Great Depression, attacking, yeah, Canada was on the radar big times then even, okay? And we responded with more tariff. So we had these beggar thy neighbor policies, as they call them, okay? It was a response, okay, to certain types of tariff that was being, you know, in this case, so they're using the tariff now for some other reasons, okay, than merely the idea of protecting manufacturing industry, which was the usual argument, okay, the infant industry argument. And as you know, this led to a trading system that was coming apart with all kinds of conflicts, not unlike what we're seeing now, okay, by the way, you know, that, as you know, both during the Great Depression and eventually culminated in World War II. And it's not completely independent of what these policies were enacted and put together during the 1930s. Okay, very similar problems with similar results. You know, as we know. So in the 1930s, it took the form of a tariff war, basically, okay, of beggar thy neighbor. And of course, it was accompanied, as you know very well, in some countries, it was accompanied with rising fascism, aggressive imperialism, you know, in Europe, you know, and Asia as well. Okay? And this is all part of what we're witnessing today, a bit of a repetition. Now, in both the capitalist countries of North America and Western Europe, as well as I would say in most of the developing world, the early post-war period ushered a kind of, as everybody knows, I mean, we hear that every day now. Carney was talking about our prime minister, yeah, in Davos just recently. It ushered a US-centered era of managed trade and restricted financial flows until the collapse of the Bretton Woods systems in the early 1970s. Okay? And for instance, in Latin America, as a good example, you relied, you may have Mexico, but you know, other Latin Americans relied heavily on they used tariffs and industrial policies, you know, of import substitution and all that, in order to be able to pursue and to promote industrialization. Okay? Now, both the collapse of Bretton Woods and also because of the oil price shocks in the 1970s, you know, the big shocks that took place, this pushed Western governments via the central bank. Remember, because the central bank, as we saw there, even before John Taylor, they thought that the primary role at that time, yeah, under monetarism, as you know, with Milton Friedman and all that, it was to fight inflation. So if you believe in the quantity theory, that must be it. You know, all we have to do is control the money supply and everything stops. But at that time, they began to adopt what I call aggressive anti-growth or austerity, okay, of high interest rates. That in the case of Latin America, and indeed much of the global South, culminated, as we know, in the 1980s debt crisis, okay, which had, of course, very long-term consequences in terms of long-term stagnation. But by the way, it was not specific only to Latin America. As I said, monetarism initially, the Volcker kind of era, and then subsequently, the answer to the question that I said earlier about the productivity growth way collapsed, it happened to have collapsed exactly around that time, in the 1970s. it started to slow down and stayed on a steady path of very much lower growth and productivity because it had low growth. You know, there's a strong correlation. It's called Verdun's, my God, I'm sorry that Verdun's, what is it? Verdun's law, okay, that associates growth and productivity growth. They're positively related, okay? That if you're going to have growth, you'll also have productivity growth for all kinds of obvious reasons. Because if you have low investment, for instance, then of course you have very little embodied what we call technical change, meaning that it's incorporated in the new investments. We're going to, I mean, you're not going to build a plant and buy equipment that is going to be of the other century. You will buy new stuff. You will incorporate, embody new techniques, okay, that are available by definition. So that's why you get this Verdun effect. Okay, and that's why, as I said, ever since the 1980s, I mean, you like 70s, actually, in the 70s it started, you see this kind of almost plummeting there of productivity growth. Okay, now, however, throughout that post-Bretton Woods era, the espousal of neoliberalism in the policy sphere meant a coherent pattern of liberalization of trade in tandem also with the liberalization of finance, okay, financial markets. But this neoliberal era has been changing, beginning already during the first Trump administration, okay? And now much more so, as we see in the second, you know, in the Trump administration, that is creating havoc in the world as we knew it, so to speak. Major change. Therefore, after almost 2 centuries, what we are actually witnessing is a much more aggressive de-globalization policy that is now, once again, we're seeing the world through the eyes of what? Well, it's through the eyes of what you think you're in the 18th century or in the 17th century, which is a kind of predatory form of mercantilism. Okay? And as is well known, guided by a commodity view of money, remember how we talked about it on Tuesday, okay? The mercantilists of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries believed that nations could become wealthy only by appropriating and accumulating precious metals, gold and silver. Since that was the only hard currency kind of around, now it's the US dollar, by the way, you know, it's the hard currency. Then it was something backed by gold, okay? And hence, for a nation to become wealthy and powerful, it had to run a trade surplus with the rest of the world, right? You have to run a trade surplus. Now, in contrast, running a persistent trade deficit was for them a sign of perpetual impoverishment, literally, if they did that. Now, in the modern context, if we look at, again, given the kind of Trump's obsession with gold, okay, we are once again returning to some kind of neo-mercantilist era. And as we saw, for instance, on the April 1st, whatever, April Fools or whatever the date it was there, Liberation Day, okay, the Trump administration wanted to apply tariff rates on countries as a function of what? As a function of the US trade deficit, so as to revert that and achieve trade surpluses with the rest of the world. Okay? Now, the problem with that story is that, of course, you got to get the whole rest of the world, and you could do that through tariffs or through intimidation. If you get the rest of, I mean, think of it. If you're the only country who wants to run a trade surplus with the rest of the world, okay, you have to do it through some kind of intimidation here, basically, okay? Because you're not going to deal with China, especially that way. Okay? But the problem here with the Trump's fixation with the US trade deficit is that it's a completely upside down world, even to the old mercantilism. Okay. Now, in what way? Well, one must first take note of the fact. Okay. All those countries that are running a trade surplus, I don't know, Mexico, I guess, or Canada, maybe, depends what. And also how you define, it's not even true, some of that, but depends when, and certainly also to what extent, and how narrowly you define it, okay? Because you could have, for instance, a simple example, we had in Canada last year, we had a trade, we used to have, the US had a trade deficit with Canada on, if you look at commodity merchandise trade, okay? Now they import a lot of minerals and all kinds of stuff, okay? But when we look at the services balance, we have a deficit with them. So the overall one, it goes all over the place. It's not systematically. So it's a lot of there are things that are not even true at all, I'm saying, but let's just imagine that he's right there, that he's got this trade deficit problem, okay? Well, what we saw, of course, is that all those countries that have been running supposedly this trade surplus were actually, first thing to note here, not only did they're giving up real resources, okay, that are their workers and these companies were producing real things to do what? In order to receive what we could call US dollars here in exchange, okay? While the US supplied all those trading countries with what exactly? Of course, it's the world reserve currency, if you want to call it that, or at least it's now less and less, but still is majority. Okay? And in turn, they held and then recycled them as US dollar denominated financial assets so as to assure a capital account surplus for the United States. Now, what is the real problem there? I think the problem is that the rest of the world is foolish enough to accept to go on with the reserve currency called the US dollar. But because, that's what drives them to do that, in a sense. Hence, given the US privileged position in the issuance of the US dollar as a kind of premier world reserve currency, the adoption of this US-centered mercantilist policy would have seemed to be completely absurd to an economist. I mentioned one here, Robert Triffin, because he talked about this in the early 60s, the Triffin paradox and all that. It would be laughable the way I see it. Okay? However, to add to this contradiction, while they are promoting de-globalization on the trade front, they seem to be trying to hyper-liberalize their financial markets, especially with Trump's policy alliance with the cryptocurrency industry and all that he has his hands completely in it. Okay? But we shall have more to say later about all this, the current Genius Act and all the stuff that they've now put in place. Okay, with their promotion of what they call a cryptocurrency dollarization, I argue here, backed by the U.S. Treasury in part. Okay, now let me start with describing what this presentation really comes from. Because as I said, I was writing a paper. I was asked actually to write a paper for a festschrift, to celebrate a colleague of mine that we've known each other for a long time, okay? By the name of Robert Blecker. Some of you may have heard of him. Okay, he used to be retired from Washington University. And also he came off, and he's one of the few who actually has some Latin American knowledge and expertise. Out of people that I know. Now, this one originates from a research that I did with Robert, and it's in a talk that I gave at the ALASA meeting in 2007, a long time ago. And it would be surprising to you that the last meeting was in Montreal. It was in Canada. We're not Latin America. I mean, we're not, but again, I heard, I don't know if it's Alicia or somebody told me that now the last meetings are in Paris. Okay, so I'm just saying it's kind of ironic today because, of course, it's the same kind of problem, okay, at the time, which where we presented that paper, that original paper, and then at a conference, we followed about 6 months later, whatever, we followed it and presented it at a conference that we had been invited to at UMass, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, in a conference in honor of Jane D'Arista, another person I knew. Now she's very old, but still alive, from what I understand. Okay, and it was on this whole question that it came out. Actually, the article came out in a book that you had on the reading list, by the way. Okay. It came out eventually. Remember, the conference was in the middle of the financial crisis. Let's say in the case of Jane D'Arista, it was, I think, May of 2000, at the beginning of first of May or whatever it was, of 2008. But the actual book came out, like sometimes it happens. Okay. It took, what is it, 6 years? Okay. It took 14 okay, to come out. Okay. And the paper was on North American monetary integration. It came from that. So part of the reasoning, whatever we're going to talk about, came from that initial one. And by the way, the reason why, actually as a kind of aside here, just to qualify that, the reason why it was in Montreal, it's exactly the same reason why it is now in Paris. Because in this case, they didn't want to let in Cuban, let's say, speakers and colleagues, and even others at the U.S., because it was supposed to be in Boston. Okay. Anyways, just to say, and now it's obviously Trump, I'm sure, would not permit Cubans to go to the United States. And there's another reason, however, why, where this kind of idea comes from. Okay. And this, when we were discussing, it was a discussion we were having over that. Even Jamie Galbraith, in fact, he wrote this book called The Poison Chalice there, at some point there, on what happened with Greece in terms of the crisis, at that time, in the early 2010s. And in fact, it was over Plan B of Yanis Varoufakis that I knew. I mean, I still know, I'm saying that we were, and he had asked me to write a thing for their Syriza journal, whatever they had there at the time, newspaper. And of course, all of this had ensued as a result of the debt crisis, the Greek debt crisis, quote unquote, in the Eurozone. And that whole clash with Syriza government, with what I call the unholy alliance there, where you had the German finance minister at the time, Wolfgang Schäuble, and the ECB in Frankfurt in 2015, that decided to subjugate Greece, basically, completely. Okay, and I followed that. In fact, I wrote an article that is available if you want, and I put it there to give you the exact reference. I wrote an article in an Italian online journal at the time. So it's available in both in Italian and also in English. So you could read it in English. Okay. And it's on the betrayal, let's call it, okay, of what happened during that whole period of the negotiations. It came out remember, Syriza came to power, and I think it was in February, they decided they were pushing to renegotiate terms. Okay. And obviously the Germans and whatever, they wanted merely capitulation here. I mean, and they did all kinds of things that in order to sabotage it. And I go through the whole process of that. And it was published in August of 2015, just at the end when the Greek Syriza government there Tsipras, whatever his name was, the prime minister, capitulated basically. Okay, so it's in the context of that I wrote this paper. Okay, and during that decade, just after the actual official launch of the euro, okay, in 1999, and indeed immediately preceding the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, one popular debate internationally was about the policy choices available for countries to adopt appropriate currency arrangements. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff there. In fact, we had a book that came out with Louis-Philippe Rochon in 2003, after a conference that we had in Ottawa in 2000 on that, the issue of dollarization. Okay? And we wrote a lot of stuff pertaining to that whole crisis thing and all these proposals of greater monetary integration that were being proposed at the time. Indeed, particularly noteworthy here that I should say during that period, there had emerged a debate on how to cope with what sometimes is described as the natural resource curse. Okay? Or sometimes it's called the Dutch disease. For countries like Canada, that is an oil producer, actually, we became very important. If you looked at the share of our trade in oil, it just exploded at that time. Remember, this is the period where rising oil prices, rising commodity prices as well. So Canada has a lot of those other things there, metals and other stuff. Okay, and there was a lot of debate about that it was causing a Dutch disease problem. Dutch disease syndrome. Anybody know what the Dutch disease is? It's not a medical thing, by the way. Okay. But it's simply the idea, the argument that, because in Holland in the 1960s, I can't remember, when they discovered some oil there, oil patch somewhere there, that they, it led to a decline of the manufacturing industry. Okay. They also call it the natural resource curse. Okay? But it was especially oil. In fact, actually, just by an aside, again about Trump, remember he's fascinated with gold, right? Well, guess what? We now, literally this last 2020, the gold revenues, gold exports revenues have surpassed oil in Canada. So he won, is this something they're telling him? Because we are a big producer, as well. I mean, my country there, I think we're the fourth after China, Russia, Australia, I think. Yeah. And so I could see his fascination is more than just simply, I mean, he wants it as the 51st state here. Okay? It could be for other reasons here as well. Okay? As we, of course, know, maybe even Greenland has gold there. Okay? Now, so it was during this period, okay, that there was all this debate that was plaguing Canada in particular, but also many primary commodity exporting countries of the global south, okay? Such as, of course, as we know, Latin American countries in this hemisphere. And that had been provoked by the tremendous surge in oil and other primary commodity prices during that era. In fact, I wrote a paper that came out in Spanish. So that's one of the few ones that I have still. There was a book edited by Eugenia Correa and Jose Denis. Okay? So if anybody is interested, it came out in a book in 2016, okay, on that whole issue, because I was trying to show what was going on at that time, okay, with the so-called Dutch disease and all that. Now, at the time when we were looking at this stuff, remember going back to the early 2000s, okay, there was a typology of currency choices that were presented. Okay, I'd just like to mention them before we see which ones they were pushing for. Okay, on one extreme, of course, we have the floating exchange rates, right? it could be a pure float or whatever. Like in Canada right now, we have a pure float, literally. But it could be a different form. But it's an independent sovereign currency floating its exchange rate, okay? Given demand supply kind of thing, if you want, okay? And of course, in Canada, we've had that floating exchange rate since after World War II, except for a very small period during still the Bretton Woods year, because we were more of a maverick on that in many ways. We didn't follow Bretton Woods on that issue. Yeah. And we floated the exchange rate, except for a very short period between, in this case, 1962 and 1970. And in fact, since 1998, if you go to the website of the Bank of Canada, they will tell you that since 1998, we have officially a pure float. They have never intervened. The last time they intervened was during the tequila crisis thing in 1994, if I remember correctly. Okay, but there are other arrangements. So we have, of course, we could have floating exchange, but with bands. And to some extent, what we did between 1962 and 1970 was that we still floated, but within a band, a constrained band. Okay, but we didn't have it literally pegged. The next one is literally pegged exchange rates as we go, but these are national money, sovereign currency still, if you look at the divisions there, okay? And then you got denationalized, what I would call here, monetary systems. So like the currency board in those days, and with Argentina as an example, but other countries as well. There are other countries that had currency boards. In fact, even if anybody knows this, that Russia, before the Soviet Union, had a currency board. Okay, so it's not, so these are not new things. They were used often by colonizers to impose. I wouldn't get into that. I mean, some of you are familiar with, let's say, the currency board of Argentina, but I mean, it's a detail right now for us. But we also have, of course, a unilateral sort of policy dollarization, where you officially dollarize, but you could also unofficially dollarize. Okay? And we're seeing more and more of that. Like, well, look at Argentina. Now he's promoting, Milei is promoting endogenous dollarization, he calls it. Okay? But there are different forms, but they all have one common trait, which is you are denationalizing your currency. Okay? And then, of course, there's the monetary union, which is the other extreme. The monetary union, the ideal one, we are told, ideal because I don't think it is at all, is the European, economic and monetary union. Okay? And you may recall that at the turn of the 21st century, just before, in this case, the global financial crisis, the popularity of a policy of monetary integration was really due mostly, I would say, to the sort of all the, the marketing and the fanfare, as we say here, of surrounding the launch of the euro, the European Economic and Monetary Union in 1999. It was a big thing. Maybe not in the United States so much, but most certainly in many other countries, including Canada, because we used to have, some of you might know that we have a political movement in Quebec that pushes for sovereignty, okay, for separation. Now, I'm almost indifferent personally, okay, but there are debates around that, obviously, okay. And at the time, we had a referendum in 1995, just before the launch of the euro. And in 1996, I was in Paris. I was teaching for a month at the University of Paris Sud, Paris South. And so, and one of the colleagues from Montreal was there that I knew, who was he was a lawyer, he taught in law at the University of Montreal. And he was promoting at the time, and so were they during the referendum, promoting that we set up a system akin to what they were establishing in Europe at that time for Canada and the United States. Okay? So that's a real political movement now, not just because they thought that that would eliminate the possibility that they have to use the Canadian dollar. Okay. but not have their own currency because they were afraid of that. It would become pariah almost. Yeah? And a bit like Greece at that time, because now we're going to get to Greece in a minute. But I'm saying here there's this kind of stuff going on during the late 1990s and during the early 2000s that were pushing for greater monetary integration, even in our case in Canada at that time. And therefore, there were economists who were promoting the EMU here, the European Monetary and Economic Monetary Union, as the model for North America, as a way to remove the uncertainties arising from floating exchange rates and all this sort of stuff. Yeah? And that, this was something that would be, of course, very important, for the same reasons why the Europeans did that, so to speak. Everybody has to emulate each other for some reason. It's like sheep following each other. Yeah. Now, this support for a currency union, however, was often justified, just like they justify all kinds of things we saw with the interest rate policy. Yeah. It was justified based on what I would argue are highly dubious Mundelian, Robert Mundell. I mean, they never followed Mundell. Actually, I went through this whole thing. We lived it to some extent because I used to go to France since the early 1980s. I was teaching there in some period. I was involved at the ISMIA. In fact, one of my colleagues, that's why I knew of Eugenia Correa at the time, because she and her husband had gone to ISMIA, this institute in France that was founded by François Pérou. So I used to go there often. And in fact, we were discussing what was going on with the Maastricht Treaty in 1991 or 92, I think. I don't remember, 92, I think. The Maastricht Treaty, we were listening to that, and I remember writing stuff on that right away. We thought it was crazy what they were doing. Okay? With Alain Parguez, all these people at that time. So I had very good knowledge of what was going on about the Eurozone, what became the Eurozone. Okay? And they were justifying it then by saying, they talked about Mundell as the father of the euro, remember? Because he's the one who came up with this criteria for what we call optimal currency areas. How many of you have ever heard of these theories? The OCA, they call it, the optimal currency areas. I will not give it too much detail, except that they looked at certain variables that make no sense because nobody, I'm telling you right now, no country on this planet has decided to found their own currency on the basis of those criteria. And I think even Mundell said it. But somehow I thought this is, because a simple example, if you think of North America, if you follow some of his criteria, now it depends which ones, by the way, okay? Because as I said, it depends on what they pull out of the hat there to justify it. But if you look at the usual criteria, which is trade links, and the composition of them in terms of primary versus manufacturing, North America should be split down the middle, with the eastern part being highly manufactured, industrialized, the western part being more primary producing, okay? So if you apply some of those criteria, you could see you get this kind of bizarre stuff that politically makes no sense nowadays, but they will promote this view. So we have two separate currencies in North America, not north-south, but east-west instead, okay? If you apply these OCA logics, okay? And of course, because of the uneven and more heterogeneous regional mixes, you could get into all kinds of criteria. In fact, if you do that, you could probably reduce everything to a square kilometer for every part of the continent, have their own currency. But in any case, having said all that, guess what? In those days, in the late 1990s, at the time where there's all this euphoria around the euro, okay, there came countries, okay? Let's call them the more peripheral countries of Canada and Mexico, vis-a-vis the US, were promoting that we do something similar in North America in terms of monetary integration, okay? I don't know if any, maybe you're all too young for that, but clearly in the late 90s, in Canada, there was a lot of stuff on that. And as I said, also because there's a political movement that was trying to justify them splitting the country into, Quebec being separate nation, but adopting some kind of euro now for North America. They were promoting. Okay. And I just give you some here. Some of these, Kushan, actually Grubel, Herbert Grubel, you may have heard of him. I think he's dead now, but he was one of these Hayekian types in Canada, okay, who was promoting very, very right wing. But somehow we were very comfortable with each other, yeah, when we met. And although we didn't, we hated what each other said, okay. But at the time, Blecker and I questioned unequivocally, in this case, the suitability of an MU-style structure for all three North American countries, whereby supporters of the project, in this case in Canada, were advocating the adoption by all three countries of some new supranational North American currency. Okay? Grubel, for instance, in 1999, he did this big thing on that, where he was the finance critic of one of the conservative parties there at the time. He named it the Amero. To me, it was like, apero, when you have the, this is the Amero, okay? And which some of us would say more facetiously, it maybe should have been the neuro, for the neurotics that were promoting it. Okay? Now, we at the time argued that a monetary union was not desirable on what can be described as a Keynesian logic here, because it was becoming plainly visible in Europe by then, although we knew it as soon as the Maastricht Treaty was adopted, by the way, some of us. But more and more people were realizing that this was more problematic. Okay? Certainly on Keynesian logic, it was becoming more clear in Europe that the EMU took away from national governments very, very crucial and what we could call effective tools to pursue macroeconomic policy. Okay? That obviously would be a need for that society. You can pursue. They tied their hands. And as was being witnessed during the Eurozone crisis 10 years later, okay, what happened for Greece in particular, that was the weakest link in the chain, but there were other countries, all of the whole southern cone of Europe there, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on, all were on the hit list, okay? So it was a matter of degrees. It broke with Greece, okay? And now, why would anyone want to give up, let's say, their national, their sovereign currency and end up in a situation of, say, Greece, that, as we know in 2015, had literally been forced to sell off its public assets even to be able to remain in the Eurozone. They sold them off to German, Japanese, even to China at the time. So to get cash in order to be able to maintain spending in Greece. Well, it was also a question because given what I would call the non-symmetrical, asymmetrical power relations in a North American context, the only, you can come up with the Amero there or whatever, because the United States would never accept that. I mean, it would be completely naive at the time, what we're saying, that this guy, great, very important economist, proposing something that nobody at the White House would have taken seriously in the first place. Okay? And clearly, the only politically acceptable form of monetary integration, I argued at the time, and that we argued with Robert Blecker, was of course outright adoption of the US dollar, okay, as for both, let's say Canada and Mexico. We would dollarize. That would be the only form of monetary integration really possible. And at the time, it was argued that These NAFTA countries, at best, could envisage, therefore, being allowed to join as the 13th and 14th districts of the US Federal Reserve, of a so-called North American Monetary Union, what actually Grubel called the NAMU, by the way. It became commonly used, okay? And in contrast to those pushing for an MU-style NAMU, only an asymmetrical form here of a single currency arrangement that would rest on the US dollar would be politically feasible, we argued. Okay? And we thought that it was a complete non-starter for the problem was that was the only thing that the US would accept. But for Canada and Mexico, we said, politically, it's a non-starter. Who the heck wants that? Okay? I mean, it's a humiliation, we thought. Okay? For what? So I'm saying, so we had these people who were on another cloud, it's a my cloud out there, that were referring to the need for a NAMU, but the reality was only one, and politically, none of the countries, whether it be Mexico or Canada, would accept. Yeah. However, after over, what is it now, 2 decades hiatus, the debate is being fueled once again in more recent times by these international political developments. Okay? And for instance, just to give you an example, we know since 2023, Javier Milei, in Argentina, got elected to promote what he calls here endogenous dollarization or whatever he means still, and which has now found favor, of course, in the Trump administration. Okay? Because of the latter's hemispheric vision, Monroe-style vision of US imperialistic sphere of control within this hemisphere. And therefore, you see all this kind of renewed interest around that. And it is a critical period right now, what we're seeing. So, I mean, at the time, there was only a lone senator, if I remember correctly, I have to dig it up there, but we talk about it in some of the papers we wrote there, who was promoting the idea of dollarization for Latin America. But it wasn't a big thing at all. Now it's coming strong in a different form, as we'll see. Okay? Now, this strengthening of dollarization really stands in stark opposition to the BRICS push for de-dollarization internationally, and as promoted, for instance, by the Lula government there in Brazil and so on, and to move away from the US dollar. Okay? So you got these tensions right now, and we see it in big times in Latin America, as I said. Milei versus Lula, okay? Not the same views at all. Okay? And what we're saying here is that before we discuss, however, this whole issue of dollarization further, vis-a-vis those who want to propose some other stuff, because there have been actual discussions. Some of them who are the promoters of the Mercosur and all that. Remember Britain. Excuse me, Europe, not Britain, because it Brexit at the time, but in Europe, okay, before Brexit, of course, there were, of course, if you look at the history, it started with a customs union in the 1950s, in 1957, and then it went on to become, at one point it became the EQ. We'll see the idea of the EQ, because it was fixed exchange rates, the European serpent and all that. Then and then it became the euro at the end. Okay, but something similar, in fact, can be envisaged and has been mentioned to me, because some of you may have, and I think Monica was there, probably even Wesley. I sent this interview, and I was even asked that kind of question. And I said, I don't know enough about the actual situation there to be able to answer intelligently, but I was against the idea of it. Okay, I'm against the idea of an MU style. I'm not against monetary integration per se. Okay, there are different types, as we're going to see. Okay, but clearly the MU is a kiss of death, the way I see it for Latin America, if you try to follow that model. Okay. Now, before I do that, discuss further this whole issue, which is really about dollarization again. Okay, let me, following Rossi's article that I mentioned on the reading list there, where he distinguishes between a single currency versus a common currency. Okay, let me just take a second here to drink some water. Okay. I got a dry mouth here. Sorry. Excuse me. Now, let me just make some clarifications here before we could try to address this issue the way I see it about dollarization and endogenous money and all that. Okay? A single currency arrangement. Remember, we had that little diagram there, a table with all these different kinds of monetary arrangements or currency arrangements. The single currency is a monetary union that is perhaps best exemplified here by federal states generally. Canada, Mexico, the United States. Okay. Now, another more recent example, of course, is the Eurozone, but it's not a federal state, which is the problem. They started in reverse. They put the cart before the horse, in a sense, In the case of our case, or we actually adopted, in the case of Canada, we adopted a single currency, okay, even before we became a federal state. But it was still a colonial state with the various, what became provinces, then were colonies, okay? But in the case of but it was a kind of, it was more initially of a common currency than a real, of the colonies, let's say before, in our case, before 1867, because they still had other currencies that were circulating at the time. You could even had Mexican currency circulating in some of the colonies in Canada at that time. But and you would think it would have been the British sterling, the British pound, because it was a British colony after all, that they would eventually adopt. No, they adopted the US dollar, the dollar unit, not the US dollar. I take it back. Okay. They adopted the dollar as a unit. Now we have a Canadian dollar, right? And there's a US dollar. Actually, it comes from I think I stand corrected here, but I remember reading that it comes from the German Thaler, okay? Thaler, okay? That it became in use and we emulated, so to speak, and adopted the term. Yeah, I mean, it's arbitrary. You could have called it anything, okay? But, it is the dollar. And you know why it was? Because and it was at the same time practically, because in 1853 or 1854, when we adopted the dollar unit as the common then became single currency, was because we had negotiated a free trade, a reciprocity treaty with the United States at the time. And they called it a reciprocity treaty because we excluded, it was only in primary products that we included. And which is kind of interesting because obviously we didn't have much industry. I mean, this is in the 1850s is the beginning of industrialization in central Canada, like Montreal and so on. And the treaty that we had signed then was a treaty only for primary products that we traded freely, which is interesting. But the US, mostly because at the time they needed the St. Lawrence route to export goods. to Europe. The farmers of Ohio or whatever, they wanted that, and therefore, because otherwise they would slap a tariff. Even coming through they had to go through the Canadian side, there's St. Lawrence, in order to export to Europe. So there were logistic issues. I mean, I'm not going to get, this is a history thing that is an aside, but I'm just saying that we adopted the dollar then, and it became a single currency at the time when we became a federal state. Okay. And now that is different. So even then a common currency. Now in Europe, as I said, they have a single currency as well. The problem is that they don't have a federal state. So they're like provinces in a federation where there's no federal government, in a sense. I mean, there's a European Commission, but it doesn't have the powers. Okay? So it has no power on fiscal side. Well, our federal government has the power on the fiscal side. I mean, it has the greatest power. It's not the provinces. They're important, but they don't have the biggest, let's say the tools. Okay? And with it, the sovereign money here, sovereign central bank, sovereign central bank, sovereign money, and so on. Now, a common currency, to distinguish it from a single currency, could be where a group of countries retain their national currencies, but agree to settle their transactions among themselves via some sort of adopted currency that is common one. Now, you could think of that in a sense when you think of adopting the dollar. You may decide to choose to adopt the dollar for transactions purposes, but in that case, you have to hold reserves, and everything else there, right? But you still retain your own currency, okay? And a good example actually is in Europe before the euro, which almost followed the kind of stuff that we saw with Keynes' clearing union. Okay, now in Europe, there was the AQ, it was called the European currency units that they were trading with among themselves initially. So there was the EQ. Some of you, if you Google it up, you will find the EQ before the euro in 1999. So during the 1980s, they had the EQ, ECU, okay? And the EQ, basically, what it did is allowed to settle among themselves, the European nations, okay, by inventing what Polanyi identified as a single-purpose money, the EQ, okay? Now, another example of a common currency is, of course, I was mentioning, because I think they followed a little bit of that, is Keynes' clearing union, with the creation of a single purpose again, the Bancor, as he called it. Okay? Or even to some extent, the SDRs are not the same exactly, but it's the same idea again. They're backed by certain currencies there, and they issued them as a single purpose kind of currency. Okay? And which again is shared, by countries that accept those terms as a common currency. So it's very important because sometimes they say, oh, the euro is a common currency. It's not. It's a single currency. And Rossi, as I said, says it right there in that paper, when it comes to that. Okay? And it makes a difference, needless to say. Now, but why is this distinction between, therefore, common and single currency regimes here so important? Well, it is because one could conceive of dollarization also in that light. Okay? It all depends on how a dollarized structure is framed, the way I see it. At the time of the Greek crisis in 2015, okay, now bring us back to this period because it's important right now. Okay, I recall arguing that to avoid a disaster and bowing to Germany and the ECB, Varoufakis should have included in his plan B. Okay, remember the plan A was to negotiate for better terms in order to deal with the debt problem that Greece was facing at that time. Plan B was to create other arrangements or somehow or get out of the euro altogether. And what we were arguing at that time, what we were saying was Varoufakis should have actually included now in that plan B the possibility of what I argue would be an outright departure from the Eurozone, okay, which there was, but while adopting the euro, just as a country would dollarize or euroize, okay? Now, it sounds a bit bizarre as a proposal, right? Because what the hell is that, okay? Well, it sounds like you're just playing a game here. Well, it is a game in a sense, but because that's what it was all about. They wanted to get Greece to bow, literally, get to the terms. And that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to subjugate Greece. But why play the game here, in a sense, you know? Well, in this case, what I was trying to say is that at the time, if Greece simply and just unilaterally, they could have, after 6 months, whatever it is, I can't remember the terms of the Maastricht Treaty, okay? But you could decide to withdraw from the Eurozone, okay? No problem. Legally, there's no problem. The problem, though, for Greece is that if they went back to their original currency, it would become a kind of pariah currency or pariah government, okay? The way I saw it, okay? It would create a lot of problems for a small country like that. And instead, I was saying, I mean, I was the only one who said that, by the way, that I know. But I was saying at that time, literally, was I said, well, okay, get the hell out of the Eurozone, okay, but adopt the euro. Now, by the way, many of the countries who are at this point in Eastern Europe, for instance, who are still trying to qualify to join the Eurozone, are in a sense in that position. And I believe that Poland, well, not whoever, like, which countries there, like, not Hungary because they are, the Czech Republic, I guess. I'm trying to remember Slovakia, whatever. Anyways, whatever they are, even Ukraine probably, wants to be. Okay, I'm saying they would be better off to retain their currency and to use the euro as a common kind of thing there that you could transact internationally with. Okay, so that's what the distinction I was trying to make here between a single currency and a common currency. And also because, more importantly still, they would avoid all this kind of stuff, these fiscal straitjacket, that the euro countries are facing ever since they adopted the euro. Remember, there is the Maastricht Treaty, and then all the other, now they have these fiscal compact, or whatever they're called, fiscal pact, and so on. Like, I've lost track almost of all the various changes they made, but all of them are just simply to hold them by the neck when it comes to fiscal policy. That you cannot exceed the 3% rule in terms of deficit spending unless you declare officially, and some God approves that you are currently in a recession, in crisis, okay? There are all kinds of problems. And as everybody knows, the only time they always have this straitjacket applies, it didn't, by the way, apply to the Germans or some of the other at the beginning, who were not respecting their own rules, so to speak. But what we've seen, of course, is that every time there's a crisis, guess what? It's like the gold standard. Every time there was a crisis, no gold standard anymore. Okay, and so it is in this case, where during starting with the financial crisis, and then when they're trying to get back, it created the euro crisis because it's so dysfunctional under the Eurozone. And then obviously during COVID, again, they allowed governments to exceed those deficits. Otherwise, they would probably spread it even further, kill off more population, perhaps. I'm just saying that they have to do something in the crisis zone. So it's so bizarre. All these norms that they apply only apply in the good times, so to speak. But when it's the bad times, they have to do something or the whole thing unravels. Okay? And in the case of the Eurozone, as we know, the way they did it is through the back door to avoid many of these constraints is now through the quantitative easing stuff since 2015. Now, but I'm just saying here that the whole issue here of avoiding these fiscal straitjackets, it could be done by doing what they already have. These countries are able to avoid things. Now, they're not doing it. They're already following most of the, because that's their qualifying. Remember, it's like the test. They're doing an exam here. They're qualifying to become members of the Eurozone. To qualify, you must follow certain rules. If you meet those rules after 10 years or whatever it is on the application, they then become full-fledged members because they've already accepted the conformity of the straitjacket of the Maastricht and Stability and Growth Pact. They're all the paraphernalia there that they've created on the fiscal side since the euro was established. And so this is what we mean here, that Greece here, in a sense, could have avoided that. You know, they didn't have to conform to that. Now, it does mean that you're going to have to abide by the terms of the financial markets. But often the terms of the financial markets are less stringent than those that are established as rules that must be met in the Eurozone. Okay? So that's why it's sort of bizarre that we see this. Now, before addressing this whole concern, let me take a minute here for another important question. And then we'll get back to the issue of dollarization, because that's the one that I think will become of concern to us here. Now, and this is the question, should trade and monetary integration go together? Now, historically, the creation of a single market in national economic space was seen as a kind of prerequisite. At least for Europe, that is what they tell you. And they did go through that process. Remember, they established the customs union. There was a Treaty of Rome in 1957. Then they established fixed exchange rate arrangements after a short period. Remember, at the end of the Bretton Woods era, where they were all fixed exchange rates, except Canada, by the way. I was saying again, that was one of the few. But at the time, they accepted fixed exchange rates. But they then it got loose, okay? It loosened up from 1973 there until 1978, where it was floating in bizarre ways, okay? Until 1979, when they established the European EMS, the European Monetary System, the EMS. I get lost here, all EQ, EMS, EMU, you know, it's all the same thing almost, but you know, it's just that. Anyways, so they established the EMS in 1979 and until the euro in 1999, okay? And so there's this kind of thing, you know, that you first need to have free trade and then you integrate. And it seemed to be the case historically by nations even, you would think. But I don't think so, okay, honestly. And I get this a little bit starting from reading Polanyi again. Very interesting person here, I mean, in terms of research. Because he was very critical of Mengerian theory. Yeah, Menger, Karl Menger, who he did not like very much. He was another Austrian economist, but they didn't quite see eye to eye, obviously. And he argued that what is sometimes referred to as the Mengerian theory, remember we mentioned that in the first, on Tuesday, okay, about money. That money, in a sense, remember, it's the medium of exchange. It's like a commodity that they use, that we all agreed to use. I mean, why not? They use gold because it seems to be not tomatoes or something different that we use as a count, okay, or an avocado. But they use that to then, actually, Polanyi called it the catalactic, I can't even pronounce it right, catalactic logic or theory of money. Because it's based on the idea that money emerges as a medium of exchange, not a means of payment or of extinguishing debt here, which is, as I said, the heterodox, the non-mainstream theory. The mainstream theory is a medium. So it's an actual thing, a commodity, okay, that is used to facilitate exchange. Obviously, that means that you go from barter. So the story goes, the tale, I am sure all of you who studied economics, even the first year economics, what have you been told? That initially humans bartered, right? And somebody had to invent the wheel of trade, okay? And it was the medium, right? Which is money. So somebody came up with this bright idea, and this made it easier now, make it more efficient to trade. It sounds like a nice story. Sounds logical, but it's not true, okay? And it was Polanyi that wrote a great deal on that, by the way, okay, on this issue. And he referred to it as the kind of catalactic logic here that he felt was completely ridiculous. It's on the unity of trade and money, that they have to be together. And some would see this model of the Eurozone. In fact, we wrote a paper way back in that book in 2003 that Louis-Philippe and I wrote it with Alain Pargues. Okay. And it was exactly on this issue, okay, of this so-called catalactic kind of issue here, which is that you need to have trade initially because people exchange. Then, of course, they invent the wheel of money. And then from that, so they no longer barter and they're able to improve welfare, the usual stories. And this, of course, is what money is. Okay? Now, clearly, some would see this catalactic vision, which was embedded in the way they structured the Eurozone. The whole thing is predicated on this thing. Remember, as I said, initially they didn't trade. So it's like, instead of the idea that individuals are bartering among themselves, if they start now, and because they were trading before, let's say, 1957. I mean, obviously, France, Italy, Spain, whatever, they were trading before. But what happened in 1957 was that they all agreed to set up a customs union. Yeah? A free trade zone. Okay? And this, of course, then became the beginnings of the euro, we're told. And that the euro is a kind of culmination of this whole process. You have this catalactic process or logic. Okay? Well, okay, so this is why some would argue that even take the example of the Latin American context here, or South American context. Well, Mercosur then could become, the basis for something in terms of greater, it could become a prerequisite for kind of, a structuring of the monetary arrangements that will become possible as a follow-up. Yeah. Now, as is well known, European countries went, as I said, went through all these stages. Okay? However, as Polanyi would have argued at the time, he unfortunately was dead, he died in 1964, but there was nothing natural about this neoclassic, Mengerian logic here. And in fact, I wrote a paper with Eugenia Correa that came out in 2017 on exactly this issue, which, as we have argued, also Alain Pargues, okay, ever since the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, what they actually created was this completely dysfunctional monetary union, because what they wanted to do fundamentally, that was never done historically, because other countries, they did integrate monetarily, but it was always, as I said, through the state existing there. It could be a federal state or a unitary state, doesn't matter. But the idea is that you always had an integration or unity between money and the state within a region. Instead, they tried to do something that perhaps never existed. Maybe, who knows, in Neanderthals, perhaps, but they never existed, okay? And this separation between money and the state at the time. Now, what we've seen, of course, is, and they created, as I said, a rather dysfunctional system, which clearly is problematic. Now, over the last 2 centuries, we have seen all sorts of models of monetary development that, in fact, I wouldn't even go through that completely defy this kind of Mengerian logic, okay? And I mean, just to give you a simple example, if you take Canada, in which 3/4 of our exports go to the US, okay? Mainly because of geography, they say we are attached at the hip, you know, if you look at North America, okay? Well, clearly, we continue to have our own dollar, and it's very viable, independent dollar, okay? And we have a floating exchange rate. It clearly goes against this view of integration that was defended and, in a sense, justified for the Eurozone. Now, despite the current threats, you know, from Trump and all that, Canadian dollar has sustained itself well, actually. Indeed, most recently, because of gold prices, it's going up a lot, okay? It was kind of went down initially last year when Trump came in, but now it's the opposite. So, I mean, you know, it's ridiculous. Hence, as Blecker and I wrote at that time, trade integration does not necessarily entail monetary integration. It is not a prerequisite even, okay? And historically, you will have a hard time finding it. But yet, the whole Eurozone logic has been to somehow follow that belief, okay? And this is perhaps because, unlike, let's say, many Latin American countries, I could argue at least, Canada does not suffer from original sin there. Okay? We don't have, our debt is not in US dollars. We don't borrow very much at that level, okay? And comparatively, okay, to most countries in Latin America, I would say. And in fact, also because our banking sector is dominated by Canadian banks, okay? So we don't need, I mean, there's no pressure at that level, zero pressure at that level, okay? Consequently, contrary to the Mengerian kind of logic, trade integration need not be complemented by monetary integration, okay? They are separate matters, and we make a choice on that basis. But if we do make a choice, then you got to figure out the consequences, because when you look at the European countries, okay, they clearly made the wrong choice the way I see it, because they pretended that they could not unite federally, politically, okay, and somehow become a halfway house kind of logic here, that they would integrate only monetarily, not politically. But you know where I come from, in Canada, when we say you go to the halfway house, it's people who were in prison and then become in a kind of quasi-prison before they're let loose, so to speak, into society. So it's still a kind of prison without the, let's say, the fences and all that, okay? That is what the Eurozone is in some ways. because they don't have a federal state. So there's no political integration. So there's no way to conduct fiscal policy because all of them separately have to do it. And obviously they may not connect here, okay, which has consequences on the value of the currency and everything else. And to avoid that, they've restricted them to these rules, okay, which, as we know, make basically put them in a straitjacket. They imprison themselves. Okay? And this is why, as I said, I do not, there's a fundamental difference that one must make a choice of. Now, I don't know what I should do. Should we take a 10 minutes break and then get on to the rest? Because I just realized it is already one. Is that okay, or do I? Okay. So let's take a short break, and then we'll get on to the big question here, because I don't know if which is what I call the heresy, okay, the heretical one there, okay, that I will discuss. Okay. What's your name again?
Cristina.
Oh, Christina, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, just sign it? Gee, I don't get these kind of stuff. Am I signing anything I should worry about? No, no.
Please. I love this presentation. Thank you so much.
No problem. No, I thought it you never know. A lot of students have been coming to Zoom because one actually, she's not even here. Suzanne, she sent me stuff there on, that she was working on, but I can't help her order. But everybody's been coming with these projects they're working on. Ask the opinion. Like that. So I thought that was it. But it's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay.
Compartir supercentros.
Oh yeah, I see. Oh, okay, great. Gracias. Yeah, okay. Let me get back here where we now we've gone through, as I said, all this issue of from globalization, trade integration. Is that a necessary step then to monetary integration? And this is, I would call, almost a sort of neoclassical logic, that is normally the Mengerian logic, as we say. And I literally, you could find, actually, this is the book where I did with Alain Parguez, the book where we talk about exactly this Mengerian thing for Europe and how it led to what I call a dysfunctional system, okay? And it's in this book here, that on the bottom here, we had an article there, yeah? But it's a book that I co-edited with a former student, actually, okay? Louis-Philippe Rochon. And and you could see what it's all about there, but it's really, it's just a model, a kind of theory of the world, almost, of the evolution, rather, of the world, our society, in terms of how we have learned to exchange, and most importantly, how we invented money somehow, okay? And the way the story is told, which, as I emphasize, is the story that you get from the first year textbooks, okay? Which is we go from barter, we start exchanging, and then from that, we just exchange better through money, okay? And we invent this thing, okay? But it's not the real story. And the first who will tell you that would have been, if you read Polanyi, okay? You'll see right away that there's something wrong with this picture. This is not at all like that, okay? But I'm going to go on with another debate here, so to speak, here, that, as I said, it's a heretical question for MMT, okay? Heretical because, of course, and in fact, I'd like to start with a debate. First thing, I did not attend the debate. It was told to me. And it was a debate at a conference between two friends, the way I see it. People I know very well. I mean, reasonably well, I'm not, but certainly a lot. Jan Kregel, I've known him since I first met him in 1977, okay, at Rutgers. So a long time ago, okay? Then he was working in Italy for the Confindustria. Okay, it's a long story, but I'm just saying. And Pedro Paez, I've known him now for, God, 15 years, perhaps, or more. No, what am I saying? It's going to be 20. I met him in 2007 in France, in Marseille. Okay. I will not go further, but just to say, all of these people I've known for a long time, and they're friends, not only vis-a-vis me, but also between themselves. So in a sense, it's kind of ironic they were having an argument. Okay? But I could see right away what this argument is about. And this argument is a debate between Jan Kregel, as I said, and Pedro Paez. And it was on the question of dollarization. Okay. Now I stand corrected. Maybe Pedro is listening here. Okay, or yeah, okay. But I stand corrected because it was told to me. So I'm not going to, but I'm sure I can understand why they were having that conflict. Okay. And what is it? Well, as you would imagine, okay, MMT advocate, they support, like Jan Kregel, they would be defending that a country such as Ecuador should basically go back to its old currency, to its national currency, the sucre, let's say, or whatever, call it. Okay? And should adopt a floating exchange rate, because that's the best way to be able to protect yourself, not just to have monetary policy that is independent, but also fiscal policy, I would argue. Both of them allow you to do that, not with a fixed exchange rate and certainly not dollarization. Okay? And of course, Pedro Paez instead, I mean, he probably, at the time, he was a minister even or something. So you could say, well, maybe did he do it because he was in solidarity with his confrère, politically? Or was it because he really believed in it? And I think he really believed in it. No? Okay, I don't know. I see somebody say no. Okay, I think so. He was defending the capacity to pursue macroeconomic policies, under the constraints of official dollarization. Now, I'm going to say that, which is that I don't think even nobody wants dollar. I am not a promoter of dollarization. Yeah, as you could imagine, I certainly don't think it's a good idea, okay? Because it does constrain you somewhat, okay? But, and this is where, when I was told that story, okay, I could not imagine why such an illustrious, kind of heterodox economist and friend like Pedro Paez would be defending dollarization in Ecuador, the ability to be able to, pursue independent policy. And was it just because he was part of the cabinet or not? This is the issue. Okay? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But as I said, that is the truth. And I don't, but I do believe that there is a possibility. I mean, you're going to, as I said, my heretical question is to what extent it actually does permit you to do a lot of things, or almost everything that you would do otherwise. And this has to do a lot with what I would call endogenous money view of the world here, okay? Or the endogenous view of money, okay? But we'll get to that in a minute. Now, while there are clearly differences among post-Keynesians and indeed other heterodox economists over, let's say, chartalism and MMT issue, not everybody's a chartalist. I mean, you'll read, I mentioned Sergio Rossi just as an example. Well, they have their differences there. Now, again, I situate myself primarily in the camp of MMT when it comes to the fundamental issues that we could go through. But we've had our differences too, I would argue. Okay? And yeah, I mean, but why would one want to accept, and this is the question, why would anybody want to, in his right mind here, want to accept spending constraints on, let's say, a Keynesian state in conducting macroeconomic policy? I mean, that's the question. Only, I would argue here, fanatical kind of a Hayekian supporters like Javier Milei would embrace such policy constraints on the state. Okay, and sell their soul, even if you want to call it that. Okay. But what does dollarization impose on an economy? Okay. Well, if you read the Rossi article in the suggested reading, it provides a list. In fact, he even refers to the paper with the introduction that we wrote for that book. Okay. And I could even mention, as we argued then, okay, in 2003, for instance, okay, I think it's obvious that a dollarized country would lose almost complete control, obviously, of interest rates, almost by definition. Okay? Almost, I say that we could get into details on that. Okay? And thus of the domestic monetary policy. There's no question about it. You're giving up your own currency and adopting another one. So you're stuck with what the Fed, in this case, the US Fed, would be pursuing as policy. Okay? Which could be better and worse, by the way. Okay? Because if you look at most Latin American countries, even if you're not dollarized, those interest rates tend to be a lot higher, okay, than what they set it at the Fed. So you could argue, maybe you wouldn't mind that, okay? But that's, we'll get to that issue of the monetary in a minute. So clearly a dollarized country would face what you could call made in USA here in this example, interest rates that would be guided by concerns of American policymakers, and certainly not those of the dollarized country. They couldn't give a damn. In fact, I think they don't even give a damn about their own country, but that's another issue, okay, about the democracy here in countries and how it works. But the second thing is that in dollarized countries, when you look at fiscal policy, it would obviously be more severely constrained. Okay, absolutely. Now, why? Well, the first is that the central bank of a dollarized regime would no longer be able to purchase government bonds on the primary market to finance the net deficit spending of the state. I mean, it's going to block that possibility. So you have to rely on the financial markets, just like, in fact, by the way, in the Eurozone, okay, under the Maastricht and whatever, Stability Growth Pact and all that. Very similar situation. The second reason is that these public deficits must be financed, let's say, by private sector, banking sector, or whatever, okay, financial markets, thereby normally implying a higher rate of interest because of the risk premium, quote unquote, okay, that would be the case, or the country risk, quote unquote, as they call it. Okay. Now, thirdly, and normally, a dollarization is also associated with a process of financial liberalization. Usually, you open up your market to other banks and the whole works. You're going to be inundated, which, in a sense, is what I would say is a double-edged sword. Okay. On the one hand, it would open up the economy to foreign banks and other foreign financial institutions because of the elimination of the exchange rate risk in particular. But on the other hand, greater liberalization would also usually mean that a dollarized country would be completely vulnerable to greater instability because of the greater proliferation of banking and financial crises usually that are associated with that, okay? That you often found with the sudden withdrawal from the country and so on. You get all kinds of problems that way. Okay? So as I said, I would never be promoting it. Okay? But the question is, it's like, is there a lesser of the two evils almost, and that's where you could get into some debate, okay? Which is like the Kriegel versus Baez debate. Okay? Now, while these constraints that arise from dollarization are very real, and they can severely constrain the state in the conduct of both fiscal and monetary in nature, okay? Obviously, these problems are practically the same for I would say virtually any countries within a monetary union. Okay, and the best being the Eurozone. Okay, but remember, as I said earlier, I had suggested that maybe Varoufakis should have dollarized or euroized there rather than stay in that zone, because there could have been perhaps an improvement. Okay, it would have given him more ability to function than without, than staying in as they did eventually. Okay, so that's where you get into the dollarization issue here in general. And in the case of monetary policy, obviously, when we look at countries, let's say of the Eurozone, they've lost control of domestic monetary policy, and by 100% here. And in this case, they must rely on the decisions of an unaccountable, completely unaccountable supranational central bank. Okay, that is above suspicion supposedly, but we saw what happened with Greece, and how they teleguided the suppression from Frankfurt at the time. And they obviously they may or they may not conduct appropriate monetary policy for any individual member of that union, of the Eurozone, let's say. And as we know it, they don't, because the ones that have been complaining were the ones in the southern flank there of Europe that are the ones that were the most vulnerable when they came in. And also because when they converted was at a very high conversion rate, so to speak, and that necessitated deflation within these countries, which they didn't want. So how do you deal with all these dynamics and constraints? Okay, is the issue. Now, in some way, it can be said that normally for a dollarized country, let's say like Ecuador, there would be a substantial benefit because the country would be moving, let's say, from a regime of high exchange rate volatility, facing all kinds of risk premia. Okay, let's say if you go back to the in the case of Ecuador before in 1999, okay, and to a regime where there's quasi zero exchange rate risk. I mean, it's zero in a sense because it's all in dollars, but you still got to deal with the problem of how it was converted initially and then the consequences of that when you go from, let's say, the sucre to the dollar. Okay? But you could see that it could be an improvement, okay? Unless individual borrowers also go into debt in other currencies outside of the dollar zone now. But the problem in much of Latin America, as we all know, I think, I mean, when they talk about original sin, it's original sins in the sense of what? That they borrowed from US or, whatever financial markets that are in dollars. Not as much in euros or in whatever, in yuan or God knows what. There are. And that would create the same kind of problem. Let's say if Ecuadorian government was borrowing in the renminbi or currency or something, okay? You still get that problem of being vulnerable to exchange rate risk. But then in this case, it will be between the dollar and the renminbi. Now, moreover, on the purely monetary policy side, what we have is that the interest rate set by, let's say, the US Fed would normally be, I would think, okay, I think more than just normally would be a lot lower than those central bank interest rates that would be set in any of these high inflation regimes and so on in Latin America. Okay, so when you look at it in terms of monetary policy, I mean, they lose control, yes, of the interest rate for sure. Okay, but what compensates for that? One is the elimination of exchange rate risk. And secondly, of course, you can end up having an inflation rate much closer to that of the US, and more importantly, interest rates that would be substantially lower as well. okay? So, I mean, presumably, if anybody does dollarize, those are also considerations to me, okay? Now, I'm not selling it. I believe me, as I hate this, because this is the last person you would want to think would want to promote this. But I could see some of the logic behind that, okay? More importantly, on the fiscal side now, this is where it becomes really constraining. Now, on the fiscal side here, the constraints would actually be worse for countries of the EMU that face a complete, what I call cacophony there of fiscal rules, okay? That go back, as I said, to the Maastricht Treaty, the Stability and Growth Pact, that are of no real consideration for a dollarized country. You're not going to get somebody telling Ecuador, the government of Ecuador, that you cannot surpass 3%. Maybe the financial markets will, okay? But they probably will be more flexible than the ECB or whatever, okay? So what I'm getting at is that even at that level, I think there's a net benefit almost, quote unquote, when compared to being in the Eurozone, okay? Not that I emphasize, again, I don't like that. Now, it's true, for instance, there are other considerations within these countries, and a good example, to my understanding, for instance, Ecuador had adopted a fiscal constraint very early in 2002 already with their law, even whether they follow it well or not. But this is their decision. It's the national government that decides that. It's not imposed from above. Okay? You could, and it's like, you could be very masochistic as a government or country by self-inflicted pain. But in the case of Europe, it's not self-inflicted, because once you're in that trap, and it's a lobster trap almost, as we saw, okay, you cannot, you're stuck, you know? So what is better? And, you know, in this case, for instance, they limited growth of, expenditure, 3.5%, when after you have it, it's real expenditure. So there are all these rules that they could impose on themselves, but they don't have to. Now, there are consequences when they do, but they have to evaluate these consequences, as we'll see in a minute, okay? And there are other ones in other countries. I have El Salvador here, and so on. And, but none of them are like, if you look at, and I was looking at some of the papers on that to try to figure out what did they actually impose on themselves. And none of them are like the 3%, 60% rules, okay, of the Eurozone. So the dollarized countries, for dollarized countries, the pressure of deficit spending comes purely and exclusively, other than their own obsession, of course, from the financial market side when they borrow, okay? Now, the only difference is that one should perhaps highlight the fact that since the beginning of 2015, if you think of the case of the Eurozone, the ECB has adopted actually should be it was bizarre. Yeah, it's supposed to be QE there. I don't know what the heck, I'm sorry. A quantitative easing, not quantitative tightening. Okay, I don't know what I put QT there. Yeah, that's a typo. I'm sorry. And what it did, yeah, remember, before that, there was a euro crisis, right? There was the euro crisis starting with the Greece at the time with 2000, a bit just after the financial crisis, starting around 2010, until Mario Draghi, then who was eventually became the president there, the governor of the ECB, who said that he would do whatever he had to save the euro. And that included breaking some rules at the time, which are exactly the constraints that they had been imposing on themselves for so long. And he started doing purchases, but they did it through the back door. Okay? And in 2015, they started engaging in this case in purchasing through what we call quantitative easing, in purchasing the in this case national government or whatever securities, which basically what it did, it provided liquidity within the system. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute, okay, that increasing the reserves within the system, if you believe in the kind of endogenous money theory, then greater liquidity means nothing unless what was going on. And that's where I was giving as example. I think I mentioned that already. Yeah, and I think it was yesterday. I'm trying to remember, like I'm losing sight of which when we discussed this. But just to perhaps remind you about this, because I think I mentioned that already, because yeah, I showed some data on that, on quantitative easing. And starting in 2015, what we is that the government, national governments, right, being so constrained, facing, like Greece, facing huge constraints at the time, okay? Well, how could you appease, how could you be able to, in this case, avoid these kind of liquidity constraints for the state now, just like you would have in a dollarized regime, okay? And what happened there was that through quantitative easing, they started engaging in these asset purchase program that would buy up, let's say, in the secondary market, not in the primary market, but that is a fictional thing here, I would argue mostly, okay? It's in the secondary market, these national, let's say, government securities. So the government of Greece gets the Piraeus Bank or some domestic bank in Greece to buy it, and instantaneously almost, you get the ECB then buying their security. What's the difference? One is in the secondary market, but as I know in Canada what it is, it's just a bunch of dealers in the primary markets who then send them and take a commission from all that. Okay, so it's clearly, it's fictional a bit. This idea that one is not deficit monetization, while the other one is a deficit monetization. So if you buy in the primary market, it's called deficit monetization, but if it's in the secondary market, it's not. Okay, so we know that there's this kind of problem, and so now for dollarized regime, the actual evidence seems difficult to generalize, though. I mean, in fact, it's interesting because I looked at the article that I gave you on that reading list that I gave by I think it's Cindy Tutiven de Sintonio, if I pronounce it right. Okay, and it was an Ecuadorian economist, and she kind of looked at this whole period and evaluated both the dollarized and non-dollarized countries and how they behave and performed. So she did a number of things, both in terms of the macroeconomic side, the performance, but also when we looked at fiscal policy, how were they able to maneuver under a dollarized regime? And it's an interesting article because, it shows, it kind of identifies the concerns here that I have as well. On a personal level, I should say that I have been to Ecuador a few times, but mostly during the decade that was still overlapping with the Correa regime. In fact, the last time I was in Ecuador was in 2018, as I say there, when Lenin Moreno replaced Correa at the beginning of what is sometimes referred to as the de-Correization period. You kind of abandon all of it, he throw Korea under under the bus, so to speak, there, okay, at some point. Okay, and it created havoc. I mean, it was terrible because I remember speaking to Pedro Paez, and he was just stressed about what was going on there at the time. I remember very well. So but it is true that Ecuador had certain positive features that helped it to be able to do a lot of spending under the Correa regime, a lot of public investments that took place under the Correa regime, okay? Because of oil exports, oil revenues and all that. That would have favored, in this case, fiscal expansion, okay? But this was pre-global financial crisis, which is right at the beginning of the Correa administration in Ecuador. But during much of the Correa period, from 2007 to 2017, okay, that was actually not much of a period. Oil prices actually were not rising much at all. Initially, they collapsed. So you can't say it was because they had all these oil revenues. Yeah, it helped a bit. But much of what they were doing had nothing to do with that, the way I see it. Okay? It had to do with how you deal with the liquidity constraint. Okay? And it was during that same period, though, of declining or low growth in oil prices, that they really conducted the most significant public investments. So you can't just say it has to do with oil revenues in their coffers. Now, for instance, I mean, I just have here as an example, international oil prices went from under US $30 per barrel, then to a record nearly in 2008, which is when they just come in, of 147. But then they collapsed again completely, okay, as you could see here. And it was during that global financial crisis, which was the worst, but still they stayed very low throughout the mandate of Korea. So again, I want to emphasize this fact, okay? Now, the study by Tutevin Desantonio is quite interesting. I found it. And that's why I suggested it as a reading here, because she compares the macroeconomic performance of 3 dollarized countries, okay, vis-a-vis 3 supposedly non-officially dollarized countries, okay? And in this case, Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama versus Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru, okay, who were not officially dollarized. And it was for the period pre and post dollarization in the case, of course, of the former countries. So she compares them, what had happened. And in terms of the macroeconomic performance, it would be difficult to categorically conclude that dollarization was worse than non-dollarization. Now, that says something to me, even though there's some limited evidence about growth. I think the growth was affected, okay, negatively in the case of the dollarized. But for other things, we'll see in a minute. I'm going to quote what she has there, okay? But what is important to take note of is that, and this is what I want to emphasize, is that 90% there are constraints that are imposed. Some of them are real for sure, you could argue, okay? But 90% of the time, they are not real. It is more a question of political will to want to achieve some objective, because you could always circumvent some of those constraints. That's what I was saying about the Greece example. Okay? You give up your political sovereignty, basically, in order to, because since then they've had very right-wing regimes there, as you know, okay, as an example. And therefore, it is the political will, I would argue, that matters more than anything else. Unless you're going to be facing the Marines or something, as we saw with Venezuela. Okay, that's a real constraint, you could say. Okay, but otherwise, but let me reproduce here and read what she said here for for her initial thing when she compared the macro performance, let's say, of these countries. She says, well, these data suggest that during the period 2000 to 2020, the dollarized countries in Latin America compared to the selected non-dollarized economies have experienced one, lower growth except for Panama. So again, you start getting to the oddities, okay? And higher volatility except for El Salvador. However, lower per capita GDP growth except for Panama and higher volatility except for El Salvador. But then an average inflation rate in Ecuador, El Salvador, and Panama that was similar to that of the other countries, okay? Slightly over 2%, but higher than the inflation rates of the non-dollarized economies of Colombia and Peru, okay, which is kind of interesting again, okay? The largest current account deficits among the economies analyzed, except for Ecuador, which recorded a slight surplus, okay? All of them had the same problems. I mean, and also net FDI, or foreign direct investment, as a proportion of gross domestic product, that is the lowest except for Panama among the six economies that were studied, okay? Now, what I gathered from what she was saying, I mean, this is a kind of general, but if one had to say something was that, you know what, most of the time, there was no real difference, okay? Which means that either these countries, either dollarization doesn't matter, almost, okay? Or two, that it matters, except that these other countries behaved as if they were dollarized themselves, okay? And behaved in that way. But where it is most dramatic, and that, so right now we can't really say too much in a sense, okay? But when it comes to the discretionary fiscal policy, that's where I think we're going to see the problem now. Okay? Is it really that different? Okay. And again, she focuses a great deal on the experience of Ecuador. She's from there, but you know, where she shows here that the experience of fiscal policy, a discretionary fiscal policy, there mostly contradicts the conventional wisdom that a dollarized country cannot conduct more independent fiscal policy, okay? As it was severely controlled in the Eurozone all the time, or has been, except during some crisis phase, okay? So now let me take a good example here is the Ecuador there under the Correa administration. And I quote her again. She says between 1990 and 2007, government expenditure in Ecuador averaged whatever, 6,718 million. Yeah? This trend significantly shifted post-2007, with average government expenditure soaring to double that, basically, 13,280 million. That is between 2008 and 2020. This is when government oil revenues are falling, by the way. Yes, it's important to note the concept here, the period, okay? With the arrival of Correa to power in 2007, policies of increasing public spending were adopted. Although the rise in public debt was not observed until 2009 at the time. Furthermore, as illustrated in the figure that she has there, the notable increase in government expenditures from 2007 onward primarily stemmed from the heightened capital investments aimed at substantially enhancing the country's infrastructure, okay? Becoming an important component of total expenditure during the Correa administration. Capital expenditures increased from 5.2 in 2007 to 9.6 in 2008, just the next year, and then to 12.2% in 2013. Now, this doesn't sound like a country that was severely constrained. It obviously was in terms of being in the dollarized, okay? But what the hell were they doing now, in a sense, that allowed them to expand that way? Okay, is the issue, okay? So now we know that if we compare that to the Eurozone, The only way that they were able to conduct more serious kind of counter-cyclical public spending was when they lifted temporarily the fiscal rules, as they did during the global financial crisis, and then, of course, during the COVID pandemic. Otherwise, if you read this, in fact, I wrote a paper years ago that I referred to here, that on the Eurozone, okay, that I presented. Actually, I was teaching in 2017 at the University of Paris. What is it now? There at the time, because my colleague Marc Lavoie was there as well, and they invited me to teach for a month, and I presented it there, and then they eventually published it in Egypt, the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies. Okay, and I review, actually, you will find it interesting because you'll see all the constraints of the Eurozone. I mean, I go through the whole bit. I think I don't want to sell but it's well worth reading, I would suggest, if you're interested in these constraints. What was going on during that whole period until then, obviously 2017. Okay, but if you look at it, many of the reports that I was reviewing from the European Commission or from the ECB, okay, that at the time I was reviewing, were only then recognizing the impossibility of dealing with macroeconomic shocks. And they were trying to see how they could set up greater automatic stabilizers. And the reason why they preferred automatic stabilizers, because it doesn't sound like a bad word called discretionary spending. Okay? And the reason also because when they applied the Maastricht rules, okay, the way they do it is that they look at the cyclically adjusted values, let's say of the deficit or the deficit to GDP and all that. So they do the cyclically adjusted one here, which is a kind of, actually in the paper, I did some of that, literally. We use certain, we tried to calculate some of that, okay? But what is important is that obviously, if you constrain, you can't spend anymore, let's say, then it's going to be pro-cyclical, okay? Because it's only in good times that you get the revenues. So that if you're running a balanced budget, you only get revenues in the good times when the economy is expanding and there's spending going on there, that you collect more tax revenues. So you are stuck with being pro-cyclical, which of course compounds the problems. But to avoid that, what they did was to allow exceptionally during those crises, because otherwise they would have imploded. Okay, and so as I said, it's worth reading because I go through that whole thing. Okay, but Eurozone, needless to say, even after, it remains quite dysfunctional when dealing with the issue of discretionary spending, because of these restricted fiscal rules that they apply there. Now, this is why, as I said in 2015, given the political constraints in Greece, I was defending that view that probably Greece would be better off by Euro-rise, okay? and leaving the Eurozone and then adopting the Euro. That's why I said, it's a trick, but it's just a way of seeing maybe you could avoid some of that nonsense that they were dealing with at the time. And now, the question is that clearly, in the case of Ecuador, they don't seem to be facing the same kind of stuff. Okay? So what were they doing? Okay? That is the issue again. Now, so what did Ecuador do in trying to face the constraint on the government's ability to pursue public investments and so on, these which are clearly discretionary fiscal spending going on, okay, in a dollarized regime, as we saw with the jump in public investments, for instance. Well, as we saw when I explained the circuit framework, remember that our first class when we went through money, and the circulation here, money and all that. Well, for the private sector, and to a lesser extent, the public sectors, we'll see, it is not the specific currency used, okay, but how it circulates that is the issue. I mean, who cares? I mean, if we had an American dollar unit in Canada, for the banks, they'll still be creating money. Okay? So it's just going to be called US dollars now. Okay? So in that regard, if it's not because it's the peso or the Canadian dollar that is going to make any difference at that level. It's purely arbitrary. The symbolism isn't, but to me, the circulation process is the same, except there are, now, if you go back, I mean, I don't have my file here for the first lecture, but if you look at the problem is what I call the liquidity linkages, or leakages, rather, okay, that occur. And we saw that already in the circuit approach, where if you got a leakage, okay, then how do you deal with that? Because you can't close the circuit, so to speak. There's no closure. You have to build up debt more, in a sense, okay, for whoever is engaged in borrowing, because they can't close the circuit. So then the question is, how do you deal with this leakage? Okay. Now, in the case of one country with the banks, like in our case, it's pretty simple. They just simply extend further the debt. Okay. Yeah, we'll give you more time. Okay, you don't want to, because the last thing banks want to do is to have bankruptcy. Okay? So the question then is it still viable? And so you get this problem of non-closure of the circuit, so to speak. Okay, and the problem is that, and of course, where it becomes a big problem, because unlike, let's say, in Mexico or in Canada, Ecuador cannot rely on the US Fed as a lender of last resort. Okay. If there's a banking crisis, you cannot rely on there. So obviously that's a big problem. Okay. But how could you assure yourself from avoiding that problem is the issue. Okay. And hence, for instance, as described here, I looked at the paper that Arauz and Garrett Ramos here, they did in 2021, that I have on the reading list as well. And by the way, I'm only citing those that are on the reading list when I'm actually quoting them. Okay? Otherwise, you will have to, I'm not going to get you to look for all these books that I've been mentioning. Okay? But there were all sorts of maneuvers to mitigate, I call these liquidity constraints, how to avoid them or try to avoid them. They didn't succeed very well, but they tried a lot. And, now they refer to 3 initiatives in the case of Ecuador in terms of how to avoid the liquidity constraints on circulation. Okay? And beginning already in 2008 when they came in, or 2007 actually when they came in, the Banco Central BCE of Ecuador, okay, carried out at least 3 initiatives to try to restrict the use of the dollar. Because the problem here is you don't want to hold cash. You want a cashless economy. Because if you have a cashless economy, in a sense, okay, then all these liquidity constraints could disappear, in a sense. You won't need US dollars. You just do electronic thing. That's the end of it. And that would obviously, how do we reduce the pressure on the demand for currency, basically? Now, first, they didn't work very well. The third one is the one that actually worked a bit, but then they were booted out, so to speak. Here, then it was a problem. But the first is the government issued low denomination electronic securities or treasury bills that were supposed to be used also as currency to make payments. So it's like purchasing treasury bills. Let's say I don't know about Mexico here how it works, or the US treasuries, whatever, but also use them to transact. okay? And these securities were intended to be traded on what you would call the secondary market for these securities, okay? But it did not work, okay? Meaning they clearly said we couldn't get people to use them, okay? It didn't work well. Second prototype that they called the de facto repo there, which completely failed, by the way, that one. I mean, they go through it and they show, and even in its initial simulation that they were doing, they couldn't get people to make use of it. And this is mostly because in the agricultural sector, firms did not pay through invoicing even and stuff like that, so that you couldn't even be able to transact, okay, at a level where you cannot make payments electronically because you don't even have invoices to trace. Obviously, in that kind of society, it's very difficult, to even get off the ground here and trying to. I mean, the problem is obvious. In a society where they don't use electronic means for payments, basically, okay? And they still use cash, which is, even here in Mexico, you still have. We're supposed to go to a visit. I don't know if, I don't think even Wesley here might know, but we're going tomorrow to visit the pyramids there. And so my daughter who's with me right now, we are going to, we paid to get the tour for the day. But they asked us that it be paid in cash, in pesos. Now, it's very suspicious to me already, because if somebody did that in Canada, I would say, what the heck's going on here? Or paying cryptos, okay. But we had to do it. We had to pull out of our pockets a few cash. We're trying to cash in there, in order to be able to do this, I'm just saying that he wanted cash. So, in this case, okay. Now, who knows, because they don't declare it. I have no idea what's going on there, okay? Yeah, I mean, it's probably that. But the point I'm making here is that people still rely a lot on cash, okay? I don't think it's just a narco trader, okay? It's just that people do that, they avoid paying taxes or anything, okay? And that's the case, of course, Ecuador. I mean, so that's why they didn't succeed there very well, obviously. But it doesn't mean it cannot succeed. And especially in a more developed, meaning like in Canada, I never, ever use cash practically. Honestly, it's very rare that I have even a $20 bill or something in my pocket, because I could just pay with my debit, credit, or whatever, electronic purse there, so to speak, okay? And most people do that. It's almost cashless. It's not 100%, but almost, unless it's the underground. But now with the cryptos, they could avoid even that, okay? So that's the problem. But the third one, actually, they were succeeding more. They did succeed partly. And that's why they were able to do what they were doing at the fiscal side, okay? Now, the third, there was a kind of central bank mobile money initiative using the telephone system in particular, with their cellular, the mobiles. Called the Ecuadorian Mobile Payment System. And it was initially tried, excuse me, in 2011-12 with the cooperation of these networks of banks with the direct transfer, of deposits, like debit cards or so. But through the in this case, through their telephones. Now, the two systems tried were the Sistema de Pago Móvil and the money one, which were mobile systems, okay, for moving commercial bank deposits, much as other mobile systems of transfer you find generally among financial institutions at that time, by the way, because things have been changing, including cooperation via the telephone banking, of course, system. So they had to get this thing done. And it involved, in a sense, these systems did not involve all the creation of central bank issued mobile money at all. So they were able to, so if you could remove the linkage, I keep saying linkage, the leakage from the system, okay? If you could somehow block it, plug it up, okay? Then a lot of things could be done. And they were doing that, I would argue. They were relatively successful in doing that. It was clumsy, it was difficult, but it was not impossible. Okay? Now, by 2014, for instance, I remember I was there at one point around that time. That was scaled from what they call a decentralized system into a central bank issued mobile money scheme, and which lasted until 2018, when, of course, it was abandoned because regime change there in a sense, politically. But what is clear is that a central bank system of digital transfers was possible, and it allowed a dollarized country to avoid some significant liquidity constraints. That's my bit on that. This was probably the earliest attempt also to introduce central bank digital money in a dollarized regime, and whose purpose was to reduce liquidity demands, okay, on the system to be able to undertake greater spending, both private and public sectors. Okay, so same at the time, actually, with these. Now we'll get to the central bank digital currencies as well. In fact, we have some experts here who have been working on that, like of course Cesar and Monica and even Wesley, because we're producing a special issue on this for our journal. Okay, but some may say was not completely successful. Obviously, I mean, it was a difficult time, and they are clumsily trying to, they're groping about, as we say, trying to figure out blindly, okay, a lot of stuff. It's not easy. Yet it does open the possibility of using some form of digital type deposits at central banks even, okay, as a way to avoid the constraints of dollarization. Now, in fact, let me quote what, again, Arauza and others say there. They said the great advantage of digitized US dollar as proposed and implemented by the BCE was its absolute simplicity of access. Users did not require internet access, did not have to pay charges for the use of the cell phone line, and did not need to make any initial deposit or fill out any application. Users also did not need to have previously used a financial service. It's important because many people didn't even have banks, at the time. It's a bank deposits. In any case, and the only requirement was a cell phone operating through any one of the nationwide carriers, and person's identity card, of course, okay, whose data was used to confirm the identity of the citizen and link them to the phone number. Okay, so they were doing that. Now, good or bad, I'm saying it was not easy, but they did avoid that liquidity constraint to some extent. Okay, now all of this is merely to say, therefore, that within what I would call an endogenous money perspective, discretionary spending, whether it be public or private, is possible as long as liquidity obstacles to monetary circulation are removed. Okay? Also, again, the example, the Ecuadorian mobile payment system itself, which was supposed to be fully backed by holdings of dollar-denominated assets, but not by US banknotes themselves. So that's all they needed. They needed to have some assets there that will back it up if there was some crisis. But there was no lender of last resort problem because you couldn't get the currency from the US Fed directly. And they were able to function within that constraint. Okay? So in a quasi-cashless economy, one can still conduct relatively independent fiscal policy. That's the problem. That's the issue that I'm talking about now. Okay? In fact, this brings us to the whole issue of digital currencies, including central bank digital currencies. But before we get into the central bank digital currencies, let's say something about cryptocurrencies. Okay? a little bit about that, especially in light of the US Genius, quote unquote, act from last July, okay, that promotes dollarization, especially in this hemisphere, by now torpedoing now this through these the stable coins, as they call them. Okay? And they're doing this now as a way to re-dollarize because they're losing out there. And that's what I would like to talk. Now, let me briefly, as a digression here, finish with the, yes, bye, Wesley. Yes. Yeah, we'll get the, I'll tell you what we have to say. And now, as I said, I want to say a little, I mean, I'm sure most of you know more than I do even, okay, about cryptocurrencies. I certainly don't use them. I think it's a scam. But I won't even say, I won't comment on whether you use it or not. But from what I would call the rhetoric, basically all this nonsense that they spew out, okay, by its Hayekian advocates, promoters of somehow liberating humanity, as I say, from the yoke of government control of money, okay? Private cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoins, which is the most important one still, okay, are very much, by the way, if you go back to our first class, they are very much in that metalist tradition of money. It's virtual metal, okay, but it's a kind of metalist tradition of money, as was understood already in the Middle Ages. Okay, so what are crypto? The only thing that is new about it is that it's now virtual. But otherwise, it's all about mining gold or mining Bitcoins now or whatever. It's all the same vocabulary almost as we saw in the first class. Okay? Remember that the whole idea of money in the original mainstream tradition was that they wanted it to be the unaltered, non-modified, okay, gold in order to facilitate exchange without somehow being indirectly taxed by the state authorities. By means of what? By changing the precious metal content of it. Okay? Also, and most importantly, gold was seen as an one-sided asset without also being the liability that would circulate as money. Remember, all the money that we've seen today, all the modern money, is both an asset and a liability side to it, whether it be bank money or central bank money. Okay? But the way they saw it in the late Middle Ages when they were fighting over this issue was that they wanted it to be one-sided. It would be money that is gold. And they pretended by building up systems that would back it. Remember, the gold standard, all that was to back it by gold because it had to be, in a sense, there shouldn't be any other, it shouldn't be a government liability. Okay? Now, and this is important because the question is, what are Bitcoins now? Right? And as we know, the whole ideology around Bitcoins feeds directly, completely, as I say here, into the medieval narrative of the private control of money, a la Hayek almost. I don't know if ever you people have read Hayek. It's well worth reading because he talks about how we could develop competing currencies, private competing currencies, and show how whoever's the winner in a sense, there's a whole thing. It's like the law of the jungle kind of, what do you call it? A kind of a view that through competition, through rivalry, you get the best currency will win at the end. Okay, it's just it's quite curious. But I mean, I'm not only am I familiar, I've written some stuff on that. on the different views of money here. But it's interesting to see here that what we're seeing is that they're feeding exactly into that ideology. A Bitcoin in particular is perhaps the most certainly an asset, okay? It's a completely speculative asset, of course, that is supposedly fixed supply, a bit like gold, right? I say supposedly because somebody decided it shouldn't be more than whatever it is. Or I can't remember how many billions, but it is until somebody decides otherwise. That's the way I see it. Okay, because I mean, these promises mean nothing. As I said, there's no IOU. Get it? Once you buy that thing, you're on your own. It's an asset for you. It's a purely speculative asset. And you depend on some other sucker to buy it if you ever want to sell it. Okay? And that's it. And hopefully sell it at a higher price. Now you would incorporate that as because if you fix the supply, yes. But not all of them are that way, by the way. But the point I'm trying to make here is simply that it is a speculative asset, but it's a liability of nobody. When you buy it in virtual space, it's purely an asset. Yeah. And it's only an asset because you're hoping somebody else would be able to buy it from you eventually. And in fact, the only reason why I think people will hold cryptos, personally, I think, I stand corrected. But the only reason why you hold them, one is for speculative purpose. So yeah, and that's what they sell it to you as. Make money out of nothing. Now, it's ironic. Milton Friedman said there's no free lunch there, by the way. So I know it's something that you have to be careful and beware. But the point being that, yes, they are you can make money out of it. Some become millionaires in Bitcoins, as we know, but some suffered big losses because it's very speculative. And second reason, of course, is because it's really great for the underground economy. Okay? Because, it's better than cash. Because cash that could trace if it's narco touched or something, I don't know, even they analyze the actual material. Instead, in the case of that, they can't trace it in the first place, and it's purely virtual. Now, cryptos, therefore, cannot be money unless these organizations, if they set up their own banking operations, the way I see it. I mean, as I said, they are not held primarily for transaction purposes. But most importantly is that they cannot, I mean, they created something on a one-sided view, but the only way to become a two-sided, remember, asset and a liability, is when they start to advance credit in crypto money. And there have been attempts, I mean, we've been seeing, we see this stuff going on right now. So then you could say, yes, maybe it could become money. But clearly, if that's the case, then you're going to have to start to regulate that system big times, because that's where you're going to see all the problems that we face already with the global financial crisis for the banking sector. So if they just are reinventing the wheel, in a sense, reinventing the banking in order to become real money, then I would say we are, it's better to avoid them, obviously. Now, this brings me to the last of the things I wanted to say, which has to do with dollarization through stable coins. Now, actually, I can figure out, I read the Genius Act and I had to Google it there to find out what the hell it's called. And it's an acronym. I thought it was genius because, Trump thought he was a smart guy, and promoting cryptos. But in fact, it's genius because it's called the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stable Coins Act. It's a mouthful, but it is something whose ultimate purpose, I would argue, in the context of our discussion here, is to promote dollarization via dollar-denominated stable coins that would be backed by the US dollar-denominated assets. That's basically what it is. It's promoting something that not just, let's say, the American public would be able to hold, but anybody on the planet, and almost instantaneously engage in transactions and so on. Now, its purpose is to facilitate crypto trading, as I argue, for users in all these countries, and therefore to be able to access US dollars directly. Okay? It makes that possible in a big way that is completely new. Now, much of the debate has been about what the genius, since July when they adopted it, if you read some of the stuff on that I understand. I mean, probably you know more than I do if you've been studying this stuff. Okay? But clearly, the debate has been about what the Genius Act permits as reserve assets held by the issuers of these stable coins, such as uninsured deposits in banks, shares of like credit unions and banks, which are all very risky and indeed not very liquid. Okay, and thus could be prone to runs here and to risky, to fluctuations. So it's what they say is guaranteed. Well, if you're guaranteed with assets that are themselves very risky, then you don't have very much guarantees, in a sense. Okay. Currently, in fact, the largest stablecoin issuers hold a significant share of assets that are not risk-free or liquid, such as secured loans, bitcoins, precious metals, and other investments, which themselves are really highly volatile, very risky. And clearly, the Genius Act, again, I like the name, they're really bizarre, and accelerates digital dollarization, the way I see it. That's the intent. And it is by expanding the extent of dollar-backed digital assets globally, particularly in the developing economies. And remember, all of this is happening because there's pressure now from the other side, not just from the BRICS per se, but mostly China. Okay? So you got this kind of reality. You're seeing this kind of clash now over these crypto coins issuing. Who's going to do it and who's going to force and acquire what we could call seigniorage revenues almost from it. Okay? And the widespread use of these dollar-backed stablecoins internationally, for example, in Latin America, could fuel what I call a digital dollar zone, okay? Which can strengthen the demand for reserves in US dollar-denominated assets in general, but in the case of stable coins in particular. However, and actually, I should have mentioned this from the beginning. What are stable coins? I mean, they're stable until they become unstable, I would say, personally. But the stable coins, meaning that they're going to set up a system that is able to buy and sell if you back them by assets, other assets. The problem is which assets do you back? That's why I was saying earlier that when you look at what they back them with, in reality, they're not so stable. Okay? But let's assume they can. Because at the end, the only one that can will be the US Treasury. Will they then sink it if it's a big crisis? Will they sink money into maintaining the stable coin is the issue. Okay? In any case, we know also what it could. Now, what could it do here? So, I mean, yeah, the idea is to have a digital dollar zone in the world. That's the intent. That's the way I see it. And it can lead now to a number of problems. One thing it can lead to is a widespread banking, what we call disintermediation, even in the already dollarized and quasi-dollarized countries. Okay? whereby the adoption, let's say, of US stable coins by the public, all it will do is drain deposits from the traditional banks in those countries, potentially creating problems of, that our traditional banking sector could face. Now, to prevent some of these consequences, what I think the Ecuadorian experience from 2014 to 2018, where there was some relative success, I would say, okay, is that it shows that it would be possible to offset this demand for foreign stable coins by the introduction of central bank digital currencies. Okay? Even in a dollarized regime, as we saw in the case of Ecuador, fully dollarized regime is possible. Now, I'll stop there, but I just want to say here that it is a possible one. Now, we could discuss this. In fact, there are some experts here who would be able to correct me on that if I'm wrong. But it's true. There's a whole literature. I mean, I've known for a while now, what's his name? Uli Binsil, because he's the head of who works on the European, the ECB on their project there to build up a what do you call that? Digital, a central bank digital currency system in place there. And I remember that was one of the first things that we talked about, because I actually published a paper of his in 2019 in our journal on exactly that question. And one of the biggest concerns, even then he had, was exactly that. What happens to the banking sector? Okay, when you introduce that you introduce that, but when it's a national currency or super, in the case of the Eurozone, okay, currency. Imagine if it's the stable coins, US dollar ones now, get being promoted, how much worse it could get. But he was concerned about that already, because what it could do is, of course, squeeze the banks. Remember the circuit here. The bank advances money and it's trying to get it back. But if now it goes into central bank, so it goes into this whole called reserves at the central bank, from which you could transact and hold deposits directly if you're the public. How then do you get it back? What are you going to do to have a compensating system to make these banks survive, basically? Okay. But this is a problem that becomes even worse in a dollarized country. So the whole problem of the circuit there is going to be a concern for sure, not to mention something more disastrous that could occur. Anyways, I'll stop there and maybe take some questions at this point. I more or less wanted to say what I had to say.
I was thinking about this thing that you said yesterday about the secret and how that's tied to, they at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, listo. Gracias. So how at the beginning of the process, banks, it's like make some holes, and they try to put the air from the to cover it.
Covered, yeah.
Yeah, but my question is that you mentioned always this thing that the quantitative easing means for this big program purchase of securities. My question is how the banks can be to be leveraged about this QE program in trying to cover that holes, because since my point of view, okay, the central bank is purchasing all the bonds and giving them in exchange some liquidity. Yeah. And even in other cases, they are just trading with another bonds. They banks give to the bank, central bank bonds with bad quality, and central bank gives them some government bonds that are in a superior quality in the pyramid. So my question is, it's a way they can be leveraged. I mean, the banks can be leveraged and have some profits. So in the
no, actually, okay. Well, that if it's the profit side, I don't think it's profitable at all. Okay, I did a study. I could give you the reference. I published a paper in the Journal of Economic Issues in June 2017. Okay, and it was really one of the things I was concerned about on bank profitability in particular. And it was in part in response to a study done that was never actually, I think it was a working paper only, because I can't remember now. Maybe it did publish at the end, but I don't remember. And then it was a working paper from UMass. There was Epstein and Montesino, one of his students at the time. And they argued that this was very profitable for the banks. Now, I questioned that, okay? Why? Well, because of course, if you look at QE, what they were doing at the time, it was not, now maybe they did do it under the table, so to speak, but they were not there to buy assets that were corrupted, that were, at the time, remember these assets that were basically toxic assets, okay? They could not buy those. So they had to buy ones that were supposedly not taxed. But even if they did, then yeah, they bought those, and that provided support for these banks that could have gone under, because they introduced QE at the time during that period when of the financial crisis. But question was, would it impact them generally? And I did a whole empirical exercise on that. Okay, I basically ran a whole bunch of regressions there, where I had a model that I developed, that I'd worked on for years on bank profitability. And I looked at that for the US at the time and see what happened during this whole asset purchase period. And what was very clear was that it was actually reducing profitability. Now, why is the question? The answer is very simple if you accept the kind of, again, endogenous money theory argument. Because what's going on here is that all of a sudden, they are buying up all these assets, whether they're toxic or not. Let's assume they're not, which they were not supposed to. Okay. It was illegal. Okay, at the time for the Fed to do that. But who knows? Okay, I'm just saying as a matter of fact. And even if we assume that they were all illegal and everything was good there, okay, then what was happening was that they basically spreading liquidity in the banking sector, building up all this liquidity. All these reserves are going up, but reserves are like a hot potato. Because all it means is if you have if you have more reserves, you want to get rid of them. They're not, but you cannot, the monetarist theory of it is that, remember we emphasize that fundamental difference. Monetarism says when you build up reserves, banks try to lend out, okay? They lend out, and let's assume they're able to lend out to another, whatever, to a household or anybody, okay? The problem is, what do you do with it? It goes back into the bank of somebody else, basically. I'll give you a simple example. We were building our house at that time, literally. And one of the things that so you all of a sudden you get a loan from the bank and you pay whoever the contractors. What do they do with it? It goes in the bank again, right? So all those reserves are essentially, it's like the hot potato, it just goes from one hand to the other, okay? Or it goes from one bank to the other. So the whole system collectively is going to find itself with more reserves, all the time that you can't get rid of. You can't get rid of those in the system. Because otherwise, how does it work? I mean, if I lend it out, somebody else is going to end up with those reserves. Okay? It just goes from one hand to the other, so to speak, in the banking sector. And therefore, if you build them up, it means that what's going on there now is that if the option, remember, well, initially, it meant that you had no performing assets for the banks. They're getting zero return for those reserves, or, which is what they allowed them to do at one point, is to buy let's say government securities or stuff like that, okay? But then it's compared to what are the other securities that they had to give up at the time. So if they were buying up, let's say, mortgage-backed securities that provided, let's say, 5% return, but the bank instead held government security at 0.25% at the time or whatever, or at 1%, that was a loss for the bank. It would reduce their profitability. Do you see what I mean? So that's why I'm saying it's a complicated thing, but I could send you the paper. Maybe you'll read it more carefully and see what I mean there. So I'm not clear at this point. Yes, oh, sorry.
Thank you, Professor Seccareccia. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to be just one.
No, okay. We could talk about it after.
Okay. And I completely understand the argument that you try to bring here to the benefits in the short term of a dollarization in terms of.
But I
completely understand.
Want it.
That you are not promoting it?
I'm not promoting. I don't.
Okay. Okay. We're fine. We're fine.
I emphasize that. Absolutely.
So, but I would like to hear your thoughts on long-term consequences of dollarization for a country that they are aiming to engage in the articulation of monetary and fiscal policy in order to structural change and development. Mm-hmm. So could you please say a word on that?
That's a kind of $1 million question a bit, you know.
$2 million question.
2 million, okay, not a million, or even $1 billion. No, look, first thing, as I was trying to say, I'm not selling on dollarization, but I'm just saying is that if you look at what are the constraints, and you compare it to some of those monetary union constraints, I think I'd rather be dollarizing, okay? But it's like Greece versus Ecuador. I think Ecuador came out of it better, almost, okay? However, it's obvious. I mean, is this the best way to be able to finance development? If the biggest problem, and I got another paper for you, okay? Because I thought about some of that, okay? And I wrote it with a former student of mine, Hassan Bougli, in there, that you might know of him, who's Moroccan. He's also Spanish speaking, by the way. You know, I'm just saying, he is very good. And he and I wrote a paper, literally in October, smack at the time of the Lehman Brothers, collapse in 2008. Okay? And we had a conference, and we presented a paper. I think even Pedro was there. I'm trying to remember now, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Okay, and because we wrote it in the context, we were trying to remember at the time there was the Stiglitz Commission on the new international monetary landscape and all that. Okay, and we wrote a paper on this whole issue of financing development for countries by seeing, is there some way of avoiding this sort of original sin problem, which is usually the reason that we get into these dollarized indebtedness issue and into trouble, I think. And at the time, we said, well, look, there's a simple way without revamping the whole monetary system. Now, I will not go through the whole bit about that, okay? But what we thought, we were actually at the time, we were trying to engage with Jane DeRista among the people were that on that issue of finance and development. And what we were arguing was that there are ways that are of interest to many parties in this thing, okay, where they would set up a kind of almost insurance type system in place on advancing for the financing of development for the countries that, let's say, if you have to import capital goods, stuff like that, whose purpose is to finance, let's say, industrial development of the country, how can we do it by securing stable exchange rate? Okay, that would not lead to a disaster if the country faces a crisis. Okay? Because that's where all of a sudden the dollar burden, if they borrowed in dollars, would be it would lead to a bankruptcy, basically. Okay, so what we had done at the time was to try to articulate, okay, what would be a system in place. Now I'm going to just tell you where it's in our journal there, the International Journal of Political Economy, and it was in 2009. I think I sent it to somebody, I don't know, but it doesn't, maybe, yeah, you got it there. Okay, I'm sorry. So Danielle could probably send it to you, but I could send it to you, but I'm just saying that where we go through this thing, okay? And it's based on this whole issue of hierarchy of currencies and all that, okay? Because we were concerned about how you could do this, how to navigate and avoid, for development purposes, the whole financing quagmire, in a sense, the whole problem, okay, of how debt could explode easily, okay? So, yeah, I mean, that was our answer, in a sense. Certainly, it wasn't dollarization. We don't want that, okay? And so it was a kind of, what's the term? A response to dollarization as the alternative. And to me, it's there that somehow, if we're able to get the handle, and as I said, one way, remember, I think what Cesar refers to even special purpose, I say Polanyi issue, special purpose versus general purpose, monies and all that, okay? It's like, again, it's the common currency versus the single currency. If we could agree on a common currency, a bit like the kind of Keynes bank core and all that, okay? I think there are better ways, but that's where you have to revamp the whole landscape, okay, of the clearing union and all these sorts of things. That would be the ideal, the way I see it. But what's the second best? I mean, the reality is that we're not going to get, I mean, on this planet, especially today, what kind of agreement can we possibly have? Okay? It's no way, it's dreaming. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that if there are some other ways, and we had proposed a little thing there. We had proposed it for that Stiglitz Commission, by the way, okay, at the time. Never went anywhere. But at least, we were trying to struggle with that. Now, maybe we were not right about it, even with that. But I think that should be the route to follow if we want to have some kind of broader agreement that doesn't require any major institutional, political, whatever, revamping of the world. Okay? Because that's not going to happen. I mean, as much as I would like to believe it's possible. But in an ideal world, yeah, we don't need all this nonsense. We could do things in a different way, but it's not going to happen. But I hope I don't know if I answered to you again, but that paper, you should look at it, honestly, or I'll send it to you.
Okay. Bueno, con esto acabamos el curso. Le damos las gracias al profesor Seccareccia por habernos acompañado. Creo que ha sido muy, muy valioso y muy útil para todas y todos los que hemos estado aquí, los que lo están viendo por YouTube o lo verán eventualmente por YouTube, ¿no? Bueno, como saben, las sesiones se quedan ahí en la página del instituto por si quieren regresar a ellas, por si quieren recomendárselas a alguien, ¿no? Para que se actualice y tal. Y pues nada más agradecer al profesor Seccareccia, agradecer al equipo técnico del instituto, al director, a la secretaria académica, a la secretaria técnica, a la secretaria administrativa, que hicieron todo esto posible, y reiterar que todo esto se inscribe en el proyecto PAPIT de tensiones financieras, no me acuerdo dónde está el título, bueno, pero en el proyecto PAPIT, ¿no? Y pues muchas gracias, les esperamos en el 20 tenemos, bueno, a las 5 estamos en el CISAN, por si gustan acompañarnos, ¿no? El profesor Seccareccia va a hablar un poquito sobre Canadá, entonces creo que es un tema bastante interesante ahorita. El 20 de febrero es el seminario del Sur Global, viernes 20, va a ser aquí en el instituto, y la siguiente semana, 25 y 26, vamos a tener el Semecofin 26, ¿no? Que va a ser también por acá, entonces les esperamos en cualquiera de estos eventos o en todos, si se puede. ¿No? Bueno, muchas gracias y le pedimos un aplauso para el profesor Seccareccia.
Thank you. Actually, I thought you would ask a question. I was No, thank you.